I have been the Duke of Hartwell for 22 years, and I have been afraid for exactly 10 of them. Not the fear a man carries into battle, though I have known that kind as well. I fought at Salamanca in August of 1812 under Wellington, and I know what it is to wait in the gray hours before a charge with several thousand other men, all of them holding the same particular silence, all of them managing the same arithmetic in their chests. That kind of fear has a shape to it. It points in a specific direction, and the direction changes into action, into noise, into the end of the waiting, and so the fear itself ends, one way or another. The fear I am speaking of does not resolve. It does not point toward action. It accumulates. It builds quietly over years, the way sediment builds in still water imperceptibly at first, and then more than you realized, and then you move and discover the depth of what has gathered. It is the particular, wordless, entirely specific fear that comes from loving a woman in silence for a decade, watching her, from across drawing rooms and dinner tables, from across the polished expanse of ballroom floors, from the far side of every landscape you share, prepare to give herself to another man. That fear ended this morning. I want to tell it properly, from the beginning, because the beginning is the only place from which the rest of it makes sense. I want to tell it in my own voice, not the composed, controlled account a duke assembles when he has learned from long experience that composure is the currency of his position, but the honest one, the one that does not flatter me, the one that shows the shape of 10 years of love and avoidance, of words not said across 1,000 occasions that would have accepted them. That account begins not in a ballroom or a cathedral, but in a muddy lane in late October, with a broken farm cart and a young woman who had chosen the wrong branch for the task, and who looked up at me with gray eyes and said, without preamble or deference, exactly what she thought. Her name was Cecily Vane. She was the third daughter of Edmund Vane, a gentleman of Gloucestershire who possessed moderate estate, considerable good nature, and an optimism so constitutionally impervious to evidence that it had functioned over the course of 15 years as a kind of slow catastrophe conducted in the best possible faith. Edmund Vane was not dishonest. He was not lazy or selfish or unkind. He was, in fact, genuinely warm in a way that cost him nothing, the easiest kind of warmth. He was simply a man who was constitutionally unable to weigh evidence against hope, and who approached each new enterprise with the genuine, unguarded conviction of someone who has not yet been persuaded by the previous disappointments. He had invested, in the spring of 1800, in a canal scheme designed to connect the northern quarter of the county to the Bristol markets. The surveys were thorough. The projections were confident. What the surveys had not fully reckoned with was Lord Fenwick's land, which lay squarely across the most efficient routing, and Lord Fenwick himself, who had views about canals crossing his land that he expressed with the finality of a man who considers the conversation closed before it has begun. 4 years of county meetings and rerouting proposals and engineering revisions later, the canal was abandoned without ever reaching operational status, and Edmund's share of the investment was gone. He had invested in the autumn of 1806 in a flour mill at Farnwick, 3 miles to the east. The mill had been a reasonable venture for 18 months. The location was sound, the equipment good, and the profit modest but real. Then, in January of 1808, on a Sunday night when the mill house was unstaffed, a fire broke out. The mill burned to the ground before morning. Edmund lost his investment and the additional sum he had put in for improvements. He had lent, in the winter of 1809, a sum representing approximately a quarter of the estate's annual income to a cousin named Reginald, who came to Brackenhollow with a proposition involving the export of woolen goods to the Americas and letters from a merchant in Liverpool whose credentials sounded well. Reginald departed for London in March of 1810 with the borrowed sum, a set of plate silver he claimed to be taking for cleaning in the city, and 3 of Edmund's best hunting hounds, who had apparently taken a liking to him. From London, Reginald had continued his departure by degrees and without announcement, until he came to rest somewhere on the continent, from which no repayment arrived. Edmund absorbed these losses with the philosophical resilience of a man who genuinely believed that each failure was simply the preparatory stage for the venture that would justify everything. He was not performing this belief. It was structural. It was how his mind worked. And there is something, I have thought over 10 years of knowing him, genuinely courageous about a man who is hit repeatedly and continues to look forward rather than down. The courage simply needed to be financed by someone who could afford it, and Edmund's means were not equal to the demand. By the autumn of 1815, the Vane estate at Brackenhollow was mortgaged at a level where the annual rental income, minus household expenses and operating costs, was sufficient to meet the interest payments on the outstanding principal and not meaningfully more. The principal was not shrinking. Edmund remained convinced that it would. I mention all of this not to condemn him. I have known Edmund Vane for a decade and found him, in all things that do not involve investment decisions, a man of genuine warmth and decent intention, good to his daughters, kind to his servants, generous to his neighbors with everything he has that has not been consumed by the preceding scheme. I mention it because the financial state of the Vane estate was the circumstance that put Cecily in a farm cart on the lower lane near Hartwell on the afternoon of the 22nd of October, 1815, driving a crate of preserved goods to the village market because the estate had no man available for the task. Cecily, who had been managing the household since her mother's death 2 years earlier, had assessed the situation and decided it was something she could manage herself. The lane runs east along the boundary of my estate for a quarter of a mile before it joins the road to Hartwell village. In late October, after 3 days of rain, the drainage on the eastern dip of the lane, where the ground is naturally soft, and the old drainage channel has been partially silted for longer than anyone has got around to clearing it, transforms from adequate to something more challenging. The rear left wheel of Cecily's cart hit the soft ground at an angle precisely calculated by chance to translate the impact into torque at the axle joint. The axle had a crack that had been developing for several weeks, managing its existence adequately on dry roads and waiting for exactly this combination of conditions to announce itself fully. The wheel sank. The axle gave. The cart listed hard to the left and stopped. I came around the bend from the north, returning from the morning's inspection of the eastern boundary wall with Pemberton and Griggs, my head mason. Pemberton's assessment of the failing wall had, as assessments of structural problems often do, proved to be the optimistic version of the reality. The wall was failing in 2 places rather than 1, and Griggs's estimate for the repair was substantially higher than anything Pemberton had prepared me for. I had spent the ride back running the figures, which was not improving my appreciation of the afternoon. I came around the bend and found a farm cart sideways across the road. It was a modest working cart, tilted at an angle that made the road impassable in either direction. The gray cob in the traces was standing with the patient, slightly martyred expression of an animal accustomed to waiting for humans to resolve situations of their own making. And beside the cart, crouched in the mud beside the sunken wheel with a branch in both hands that was too short and too slight for what she was attempting, was a young woman. She was perhaps 21 or 22, medium height, dark hair that the afternoon's drizzle had loosened from its pins so that it fell across her face, which she had not moved it from, either because she had not noticed or because she had determined that the hair was not the relevant problem. She was wearing a gray wool cloak that had been serviceable several years ago and half boots designed for floors rather than lanes. She was talking to herself in a low, continuous murmur, the sound of someone thinking through a mechanical problem without an audience. I pulled my horse to a halt. She did not look up. "Miss," I said. "One moment," she said without looking up. I waited. She braced herself against the cartwheel with one shoulder, repositioned the branch, and levered with considerable determination. The wheel shifted perhaps 1.5 inches, found nothing to grip, and settled another inch deeper into the mud. She was very still for a moment. Then she said something brief and specific under her breath that I will not record here, though I have thought about it occasionally in the 10 years since. She straightened up. She pushed the fallen hair from her face with the back of her wrist, the gesture of someone who has done this several times already this afternoon. Then she looked up at me. The quality of the look arrested me. It was not the quick, assessing scan that most people give an unfamiliar face on a country road, the rapid determination of who this person is, and what register of engagement with them might be appropriate. She was looking at me as though I were a problem she was solving. Specifically, the problem of whether I was going to be useful in the next 10 minutes. She had gray eyes, not the fashionable near blue that passes for gray by candlelight. Actual gray, the clear, level gray of morning sky before the sun has committed to anything. They were looking at me with the direct, unconstructed attention of someone who is thinking about what she is looking at rather than about what the looking looks like. "The axle is cracked," she said. She had a clear, carrying voice, the voice of a person who expects to be heard and has calibrated accordingly. "Not just the mud. The wheel won't stay on the axle with any levering. The joint has failed. It needs a smith." "There is one at Hartwell Village," I said. "A quarter of a mile east on the main road." "Are you heading there?" "I can send my groom ahead." She looked at me for perhaps 3 seconds, with the specific quality of someone assessing reliability, not rank or appearance or quality of coat, but the particular question of whether I was the kind of man who makes a practical offer and follows through on it. The assessment appeared to conclude in my favor. "That would be very useful," she said, in the tone of someone acknowledging the usefulness of a thing rather than performing gratitude at the generosity of a person. It was such a small distinction, and it struck me so clearly that I noted it. I sent my groom. Then I dismounted, because remaining on horseback while a woman stood in the drizzle beside a failed cart seemed unnecessarily poor manners, and came around to look at the axle. "Vain," she said before I could introduce myself. She had gone back to examining the axle joint with the focused attention of someone confirming a diagnosis already made. "Cecily Vane, Bracken Hollow, to the east, in case you know the estate." "Hartwell," I said. "The estate to the south. I am the Duke, as it happens, though I appreciate that this information is not obviously applicable to the situation at hand." She looked up at me. There was a brief, entirely unguarded expression, surprise, genuine and unmanaged, lasting perhaps a second and a half, and then she laughed. Not a drawing-room laugh. An actual laugh, quick, genuine, slightly undignified, the sound of someone who has found something genuinely funny and whose manners have not quite caught it in time. It was so unexpected and so completely itself that I found myself smiling before I had thought about it. "Your Grace," she said, recovering, with a gravity only slightly compromised by the fact that she was still smiling. "I apologize for the occupation of your road." "I apologize for the condition of the lane," I said. "That wasn't especially your fault," she said, with the straightforward fairness of a woman who does not distribute blame on the basis of convenience. "The drainage on this section has been inadequate for at least 3 years. If you have not spoken to Pemberton about the eastern dip, you should." I looked at her. "Pemberton is my steward," I said. "I know," she said. "He has been out on this lane twice this season. The first time he looked at it, the second time he kept riding. I assumed he had reported it." "He reported other things," I said. She looked at the lane with the expression of someone filing information for future use. "Well, now you know about this one." We waited for Griggs. It was a long wait, perhaps 50 minutes long enough for the drizzle to continue its work on both of us, for the gray cob to make his philosophical peace with the situation, and for Cecily and me to discover that we were each capable of actual conversation. What I mean by actual conversation is this: not the exchange of rank and position that most first meetings consist of, not the careful navigation of approved topics at the appropriate level of depth, not the mutual performance of social competence. I mean the kind of conversation in which two people say what they actually think and find that the other person has something real to say in return. She had opinions about the drainage of the lower pasture visible over the hedge to the east, specific, technical opinions. Based on a habit of observing the landscape she moved through with genuine attention. The drainage was inadequate, and the reason was the silting of the old channel, and she described this in the connected, practical way of someone who has been watching fields through 4 seasons and knows what they mean. She was right, as it happened. I knew the pasture from Pemberton's reports, and her diagnosis was accurate. She was reading Cowper's letters, and had been doing so with the particular engagement that comes from disagreeing with the conventional assessment of something she thought Cowper was better than his reputation. And the reason she thought so was that she valued the quality usually cited against him. The unguarded quality, the willingness to say exactly what he thought without weighing it for effect. She had a view on the hedgerow management of the northern side of the lane that was technically well-grounded and arrived at through observation rather than received wisdom. She offered it as a view on hedgerows, not as a performance of any quality in herself. There was no attempt to make the having of views on hedgerows into something charming. The views were simply there, available, and if I was interested, she was willing to discuss them. She asked about the wall. When I described Griggs's assessment, she listened with the attentiveness of someone actually processing what they hear, and then said, Double the estimate is generally what stonework of that age costs when the foundation is involved. Did Griggs look at the eastern abutment? He did, I said. The abutment is part of the problem. Then triple, she said, with the calm certainty of someone who has had occasion to learn this before. She was right. I only confirmed this some months later, but I could already see it had the shape of rightness. She did not ask about my estate's size or my position in the county or whether I was generally in residence or largely in town, or any of the questions that the social architecture of introduction exists to convey. She talked about the wall and the drainage and cowper and hedgerows, and she expected me to be interested, and I was, and we talked until Griggs arrived. Griggs examined the axle. He confirmed what she had diagnosed, cracked through at the joint, not fixable at the roadside, needed to come to the smithy. I arranged for the cart to be taken, and for Cecily to be returned to Brackenhollow in my carriage. She thanked me directly and without excessive gratitude, the way a person thanks someone when they are grateful and are not trying to make the gratitude into anything beyond its honest dimensions. I watched the carriage go down the lane toward Brackenhollow. I sat on my horse in the drizzle for a moment longer than I needed to, and then I went home. The gray eyes stayed with me. Not dramatically, I was not yet in any condition to brood over Cecily Vane, having spent 45 minutes with her, and not yet knowing what I had found. But they were present, in the way that certain images are present after an encounter more interesting than you expected, available when the mind touched them, which it did several times in the following days, not urgently but consistently. 3 days later, I found a reason to call at Brackenhollow. The reason was thin to the point of transparency. I had already confirmed through Pemberton that the cart had been repaired and that Miss Vane had arrived safely, and the reason I invented for calling to inquire in person whether everything had been satisfactorily resolved was not a thing I actually needed to do. I knew this. I went anyway. Edmund Vane received me in the drawing-room with the expansive warmth of a man who entertains infrequently and is genuinely pleased when the occasion arises. He was a round-faced man in his late 50s, pink-complexioned, with kind eyes and the pleasantly scattered energy of someone whose primary attention is always engaged elsewhere in the next scheme, in the promising letter from Derbyshire, in the calculations that would, this time, produce a different result. He talked for 20 minutes about the eastern field and a wheat strain a gentleman in Derbyshire was apparently having considerable success with, and about a minor drainage dispute with the Aldenmere estate that had been simmering since the previous spring. I listened and drank my tea and waited. The drawing-room door opened. Cecily came in from the garden with mud on the hem of her dress and a bunch of late roses in her hands, very dark red ones, the last of the season, the petals already beginning to turn at their edges, past their best and still beautiful for it. She stopped when she saw me. There was an expression on her face that lasted a second and a half before her composure came back. I have spent 10 years attempting to read that expression with any precision. The most accurate description I can give is that it was unguarded, which was unusual, because Cecily was almost never unguarded. Something between recognition and reassessment. Something that moved across her face and was collected before it could be fully examined. "Your Grace," she said. "I came to inquire about the cart," I said, "and the axle and whether your return was comfortable." "The cart is repaired," she said. "Pemberton's man confirmed it on Tuesday." "So I was informed," I said. We looked at each other for a moment. Edmund Vane discovered, with a timing that suggested he was a perceptive man about some things if not about investment schemes, that he had left a matter unattended in another part of the house, and excused himself. "You came anyway," she said. "I did," I said. She looked at me that direct, considering look, not assessing my motives so much as deciding what to do with the fact of them. Then she set the roses on the table and said, "Would you like more tea since you've come so far?" Though Hartwell is only a mile and a half, so I'm not sure the journey justifies the gesture. "The journey justifies the tea," I said. "The tea does not require the journey to justify itself." She looked at me for a moment longer, and then she rang for the tea. I stayed for 2.5 hours. What I learned over the subsequent months of that autumn and winter of 1815 and 1816 was the texture of another person's life, not the polished social version, not the version that draws rooms and dinner parties produce, but the actual texture of the days. which is something that only reveals itself when you are genuinely paying attention and the other person is not managing what you see. I called at Brackenhollow once a week through November, and twice in December when the weather had settled enough that the roads were consistently passable. And in those visits I accumulated knowledge, the way one accumulates knowledge about a place one loves, not systematically, not through any organized program of discovery, but through the patient accumulation of detail that comes from being present and attentive over a period of time. I learned, for instance, that Cecily rose at 5:30 and spent the first hour of every morning on the household accounts, not because this was the only time available, but because she had found that accounts kept in the mind with most clarity before the day's other demands had accumulated. I learned this not because she told me directly, but because on a morning when I arrived at Brackenhollow earlier than usual, having ridden out before breakfast to check a section of shared boundary in question for the hedge negotiation, I found her still at the library table with the account books open and a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, absorbed in a column of figures she was checking against a receipt, and she looked up at me with the complete, unguarded expression of someone caught in the middle of genuine work, no social management, no composition of herself for a visitor, and said, "The coal supplier has been miscounting the hundredweight since September. I have been suspecting it for 3 weeks, and now I have the evidence." I sat down without being invited and looked at the figures, and we discussed the proper approach to the confrontation with the coal supplier for 20 minutes before the maid brought fresh tea, and the morning's ordinary social order was restored. It was one of the most satisfying 20 minutes I had spent in a long time, and I was aware, riding home afterward, that the satisfaction was both about the practical problem and about something else, the something else being what it was. I learned that she had a particular relationship with the kitchen garden that was entirely its own thing. She had reorganized it in the first year after her mother's death, converting it from an ornamental garden that grew flowers and a few token vegetables into a productive operation, and she managed it herself with the help of one of the estate's outdoor laborers on the heavy days. She knew every plant in it by name and situation. She knew which beds were most productive and which were being reclaimed from years of decorative neglect. She had plans for expanding the glass structure she had built on the south wall, to be executed the following year if the finances allowed. She talked about the kitchen garden with the specific enthusiasm she brought to anything she had built from first principles, the enthusiasm of someone who has decided to do a thing, worked out how to do it, done it, and seen the evidence that the doing was right. It was, I understood, one of the few things in her life that was entirely hers, not inherited, not taken on out of necessity, but chosen and built and tended. I told her once in December, after she had been describing a particular system she had worked out for extending the season of the salad crops using cloches made from old lantern glass, that I thought the kitchen garden was the most productive quarter-acre in the county. She looked at me with the look she gives when she is deciding whether something is a compliment or a serious assessment. "It's not yet," she said. "It will be in 2 more seasons if I can get the composting right. At the moment the soil on the north bed is still too light. I haven't corrected it fully." This was the thing about Cecily. She was not modest in the false sense, the practiced way of deflecting compliments that women are taught because immodesty is considered unattractive. She was accurate. She assessed her own work with the same precision she applied to everything, and when her work was good she said so, and when it was not yet what it needed to be she said that too. It was entirely without vanity in either direction, and it was one of the things I found most genuinely difficult about being in her presence, not the challenge of it, but the specific difficulty of being with someone who was so entirely honest that your own management of impression became visible to you in contrast. She had, I discovered, a deeply ambivalent relationship with the social obligations of the county. She attended what was required the Aldenmere gatherings, the various dinners that the local families organized through the year, the assemblies that Lady Aldenmere and others periodically mounted. She was perfectly capable in these contexts. She had the necessary social competence. She did not embarrass herself. She could produce the appropriate level of pleasant engagement with people she found tedious without letting the tedium show. But the competence was clearly exactly that, a skill deployed rather than a genuine pleasure, and she saved what was genuine for other contexts. I understood gradually, one of those other contexts. The conversations we had in her drawing room, or in the lane, or in the Aldenmere Gardens when we both happened to find ourselves standing near the south wall away from the main company, had the quality that conversations have when both parties are genuinely present rather than socially present. She did not manage herself with me. She said what she thought. She disagreed when she disagreed, and she conceded when the evidence required it, and she laughed when something was funny without first calculating whether it was the appropriate moment to laugh. This was, I understood around the time of the third week of November, an enormous privilege. Not in the social sense, not a matter of rank or access, but in the personal sense, in the sense that matters. She was showing me who she was, not the version of herself that she produced for the drawing room. I was also aware, with a clarity that was not comfortable, that I was not showing her the same in return. I was showing her a version of myself that was reasonably honest. I was not performing. I was not producing a calculated impression, but the specific and important thing I was not showing her was the fact that I loved her. And the fact that I loved her was, at that point, the most significant thing about me in relation to her, and I was keeping it in a drawer. I told myself this was appropriate caution. That declarations made before one was certain of the ground were presumptuous. That patience was a virtue, and the right moment would arrive. December was the month when I should have spoken, or January of the following year, or March before Aldrich's visits to Brackenhollow became the thing they became. I had 3 chances, and I did not take any of them, for the reasons I have described, and the reasons I have described are all true and all insufficient. What I will say, looking back across 10 years at the man I was in the winter of 1815, is that I was not stupid, and I was not cruel, and I was not indifferent. I was frightened. Not of the declaration itself I had the words, I had composed them many times, but of the specific texture of the refusal, which I had also composed many times in the privacy of my library, and which had a quality in the imagining that I found I could not hold steadily. The thought of Cecily Vane looking at me with those gray eyes, and saying, quietly, clearly, honestly, as she would say everything, that she was very glad of my friendship and hoped we would continue to be friends. But that what I was describing was not something she felt in return, this thought was the paralysis. I was 31 years old and the Duke of Hartwell, and I had done things in my life that required nerve. I had gone into battle at Salamanca. I had managed the estate through 2 years of genuine difficulty in 1808 and 1809, when the returns were poor and the repairs were expensive, and 2 of my tenant farmers were in genuine hardship and required careful management. I had sat in the House of Lords and spoken on matters that divided it, and held my position under pressure from men who were senior to me in years and rank. I was not, on any objective measure, a man without courage. But the specific kind of courage required to walk across a drawing room to a woman you love and say you love her, when you are not at all certain she will say she loves you back, is a particular variety that does not translate from other contexts. It is its own thing. And I did not have it in the winter of 1815, and I did not find it in the spring of 1816, and I did not find it at any point in the 9 years that followed. The engagement between Aldrich and Cecily lasted 6 months, from June of 1816 to January of 1817. I have said that I knew from before the formal ending that it was in difficulty. What I have not said is that I spent those months in a state of complicated feeling that I was not proud of then, and am not proud of now, which was the feeling of a man who wants very much for something to end and cannot acknowledge wanting it, because the thing he wants to end is another person's happiness, and you cannot want another person's happiness to end without being the worst version of yourself. I did not want Cecily to be unhappy. I want to be clear about that. What I wanted was for the engagement to fail in a way that did not cost her anything, in a way that demonstrated clearly that Aldrich was not the right person for her, without any pain to her in the demonstration. What I wanted, in other words, was the impossible thing, which is the resolution of a situation in your favor that does not involve anyone suffering. I have observed in my experience that situations rarely resolve that way. The engagement ended, and it cost Cecily something. I do not know precisely what it cost her because we did not speak of it directly. What I observed in the months that followed was a certain tightening of her manner, not a withdrawal, not a closing off, but a quality of deliberateness in her engagement with the world that was somewhat greater than it had been before. She had always been controlled. She was now slightly more controlled. She had always been competent. She was now somewhat more evidently so. These were the signs of a person who has made a decision about how to conduct herself after something difficult, and has been conducting herself accordingly. She was also in all other ways exactly herself. The Italian lessons continued. The kitchen garden was expanded in the spring of 1817, as she had planned, the north bed soil corrected with a composting method she had worked out through the winter, the glass structure extended. She was reading New Things, a collection of essays on the natural philosophy of the atmosphere, which she found interesting. A new translation of Virgil, which she found less satisfying than the previous one she had used, but noted the specific qualities in which it was inferior, which she told me about with characteristic precision when we met at the Aldenmere Spring Gathering of 1817. This was the character of our meetings in the years following Aldrich: present, genuine, engaged, and containing always the unacknowledged thing between us, which neither of us spoke of and which neither of us, I think, was able to pretend was not there. We talked at one gathering or another about everything. About the condition of the county roads, which was a perennial subject and one she had more concrete information about than I did, because she drove them more frequently and noticed what was happening to the surfaces. About agricultural innovation, about which she read as much as she could access and had views that were often better informed than the views I heard in the House of Lords, where the subject was treated largely as a matter of landowning interest rather than practical science. About what she was reading and what I was reading, and whether the things we were each reading spoke to each other in any way. There was an evening at Penwick in the autumn of 1817, a smallish gathering, perhaps 20 people, at which the company had been arranged so that Cecily and I found ourselves standing near the windows after dinner, somewhat apart from the main conversation, which had turned to a subject, the likelihood of a new Irish agitation, in which neither of us had much to contribute beyond what we had already said earlier. We talked for 40 minutes. I know this because Lady Penwick, who was keeping track of social time in the way that hostesses do, made a remark at the end of the evening that suggested 40 minutes had elapsed in our corner that might have been more usefully distributed across the room. We talked about what she had been doing in the garden. We talked about a letter she had received from Alina, her eldest sister in Bath, about a new library that had opened in the upper town, and about whether subscription libraries represented a genuine democratization of reading or simply a slightly more convenient version of the same access that had always existed for people who could afford subscriptions. We talked about whether Wordsworth's poetry held up on rereading, about which she had a specific position that the early work held up, and the later work showed signs of becoming too careful about itself, that I found interesting because I had been thinking something adjacent without having articulated it as clearly. We talked about whether the improvements to the Penwick estate's drainage, which were visible from the window we were standing at, were likely to achieve the result Lord Penwick intended, about which she had a technical opinion that turned out, when I later checked it against the estate reports, to be accurate. None of this was, on its surface, remarkable. It was the content of any number of conversations between two people who happened to live in the same county and had several interests in common, and had been talking to each other for 2 years. What was remarkable was the quality of it, the ease, the genuine mutual attention, the fact that by the end of those 40 minutes I had thought more clearly about several things than I had been thinking about them before she and I had spoken. This was what I was not saying I loved her for. Not the gray eyes, though the gray eyes were a daily fact of my private landscape. Not the laugh, though the laugh was something I had been hoarding since October of 1815. What I was not saying I loved her for was this: being in her company made me think better, made me see things more clearly, say things more precisely, notice what was interesting rather than what was merely available. I did not know another person of whom this was true to the same extent, and I was not going to. I went home from the Penwick gathering in the autumn of 1817 and sat in the library and told myself, for what felt like the 10th time, that I would find the right occasion, that the situation was complicated but not permanently so, that there would be a moment. She was 25 that autumn, 26 the following autumn, which was the autumn of 1818. There was a gathering at Aldenmere in October of that year, the autumn gathering, which Lady Aldenmere held annually, and which was one of the occasions I attended because not attending would have been notable in itself. Cecily was there. She was wearing a dark green dress that I had not seen before. She did not vary her wardrobe dramatically, but she occasionally added something, And when she did, it was always chosen with the same practical precision she brought to everything. Something that would last, and that suited her, and that was not chosen to make an impression, but because it was right. The green suited her. I noticed this and said nothing, and had the particular experience of noticing something beautiful and having no one to tell. We talked for perhaps 20 minutes, in one of the Aldenmere side rooms where the supper tables were being arranged, and the conversation was about a book on estate management she had found in a Bath bookshop. Alina had sent it from Bath, knowing Cecily would want it, that had a chapter on the management of woodland in continuous production, that she was thinking of adapting for the small woodland at the eastern edge of Brackenhollow. She had been reading the chapter carefully and had notes on which parts were applicable and which were written for a different scale of operation. She showed me the notes. They were in the clear, precise hand I knew, on a folded sheet she had apparently brought with her because she had been thinking about the problem and was prepared to discuss it if the occasion arose. The notes were excellent, thorough, specific, grounded in the actual conditions of the Brackenhollow woodland rather than the general principles of the book. She had already thought through most of the practical adaptations. "This is very good," I said. "It's preliminary," she said. "I haven't spoken to anyone about the long cycle timing yet. I was hoping to consult Griggs about the timber, but Griggs had a bad back in September and wasn't available." "I can ask him," I said. "He came out last month about the south wall. I can put the question to him next time." She looked at me with a brief, direct quality of attention that was something other than the analytical focus she usually had when we were discussing practical matters. Then she looked at the notes. "Thank you," she said. "That would be very useful." She was 27 the following year. The winter of her 27th year was the winter I have already described as the closest I came the months of January and February, and into March when I had the speech prepared, the occasion in mind, the date nearly chosen. The winter when she went to Bath before I could speak. But what I have not described, and what I want to describe, is what those months were like in detail, because the detail is the thing I have been carrying, and this account is the honest one. In January of 1819, there was a small dinner at the Aldenmere estate, small enough to be informal, 8 or 10 people, the kind of evening at which Lady Aldenmere pleased herself rather than performing social management. I was there. Cecily was there. We were seated across the table from each other rather than next to each other, which meant that the conversation was largely general, the kind of dinner-table conversation in which 8 people share a subject rather than 2 people having an exchange. The subject was Napoleon, and specifically the question contested at that point, with the contradictions of Waterloo still relatively recent, of how posterity would regard him. The argument ranged around the table in the way that dinner arguments do, and it was lively enough that people were actually holding positions rather than producing polished observations. Cecily said, about halfway through, that the question of how posterity regarded Napoleon was less interesting than the question of how Napoleon regarded himself, and whether a man who believed himself to be acting for a larger historical purpose experienced ordinary moral categories differently from men who believed themselves to be acting in their own interest, and whether this explained rather than excused the things he had done. The table was briefly quiet in the way that tables are quiet when someone has said something that changes the direction of the conversation rather than continuing it. What I noticed in the brief quiet was the look that Lady Aldenmere exchanged with Lord Penwick's wife across the table, the look of 2 people who have registered that something was said and are uncertain how to receive it. Not hostile, not critical, but the look of people who have encountered a quality of thought they were not anticipating and are not certain of the appropriate response. It was the look that Cecily often produced in social company, and which she appeared entirely unconscious of, because she had said what she thought and was waiting for someone to engage with it rather than monitoring the room for its reaction. I engaged with it. We had a conversation, across the dinner table, that was more interesting than anything else that happened that evening, and that continued after dinner in the drawing room when the company redistributed itself, and that ended when Lady Aldenmere, with her habitual social management, announced that it was nearly 11 o'clock and the carriages had been ordered. In the carriage going home that evening, I made the decision with a clarity that surprised me that I would speak to her. Not someday, not in some better season. Soon, in the next week. The occasion would be the next reasonable call at Brackenhollow, which I would make on the following Thursday. I made this decision and I held it for 9 days, and on the 9th day she went to Bath. The letter informing me of this arrived through the county's social network before I had a chance to call. Mrs. Fairfax, her cousin, had issued a renewed invitation that Cecily had this time accepted, and she was departing the following Monday for a stay of several months. I spent 3 days in a state that I will describe only as the specific frustration of a man who has arrived at a decision and found the situation changed before the decision could be executed. Then I told myself the situation had changed but not fundamentally altered. Then I told myself that Bath might, in fact, be better, that returning from Bath, she would be refreshed, the visit would be behind her, and I would speak when she was settled back into the county. Then she came back from Bath in July, and I did not speak in the autumn, and the autumn became winter, and the winter became another year. The Italian lessons were going well. I heard about this at intervals through the years, because she mentioned them in conversation, and I listened with the attention I brought to everything she said. By 1819, the vicar's eldest daughter was reading Boccaccio. By 1820, all 3 daughters were reading with reasonable fluency, and Cecily had added 2 more pupils from the village, the daughters of the schoolmaster, who paid a smaller consideration but whom she had taken on because she believed their aptitude was genuinely exceptional, and that withholding instruction on the basis of the fee alone would be a waste. This was characteristic of her. She did things because they were right, and she was entirely practical about what right required, and the practical considerations did not override the other ones. In the winter of 1820, she published, though that is too large a word, she simply wrote and circulated locally a brief paper on the management of kitchen garden composting for the clay soils of Gloucestershire, which she had written at the request of the vicar, who had found that her approach to the Brackenhollow garden had produced results worth sharing with the village's other garden keepers. The paper was 2 pages long, in her clear hand, very precise, entirely practical, and was copied by the vicar's wife and distributed to perhaps 30 households. I read it. I found it excellent, more specifically useful than most of what I had read on the subject, because it was calibrated exactly to the particular soil conditions of this particular landscape rather than to some general average. I told her so at the next occasion I had, which was the Aldenmere Spring Gathering of 1821. She said, "I'm not sure 30 copies constitutes a publication." "It constitutes exactly what it was intended to constitute," I said, "which is useful information in the hands of the people who can use it. That is better than most publications, which constitute information in the hands of people who are already reading a great deal of information." She looked at me with the brief quality of attention that I had learned to read as the moment when she was deciding whether to say something she had not planned to say. Then she looked away at the gathering and said, "Lady Aldenmere is having difficulty with the woman in the blue dress. She has been trying to redirect her for 10 minutes. I looked at Lady Aldenmere, who was indeed engaged with a woman in a very bright blue dress in a way that suggested the engagement had outlasted the hostess's patience by some time. "She'll manage it," I said. "She always does." "Yes," said Cecily. "She has resources I lack." "She has different resources," I said. Cecily looked at me again with a look. Then she said, "Thank you for what you said about the paper." "It was accurate," I said. "That's what makes it worth saying," she said, and I understood that we had arrived at an acknowledgement of something, though I could not have said precisely what, and neither of us said anything more specific, and the evening continued. She was 29 that spring, 30 the following autumn, and with the autumn came Geoffrey Marchmont. I have described the autumn of 1822 as the autumn when I ran out of my particular category of excuse, and I have described the intentions I formed and the gate I turned back from in November, and I do not want to go over this again because I have been over it many times in my own private accounting, and additional rehearsal serves nothing. What I want to describe instead is what I understand now that I did not understand then, which is the shape of what I was doing in those years. I was doing what Cecily called, this morning, putting it in a box. I was doing it differently from the way she was doing it. She was closing the lid firmly, making active decisions to contain the thing, going to Bath, letting Geoffrey court her. I was doing it by leaving the lid slightly open, and telling myself that leaving it slightly open was not the same as refusing to close it, which was not the same as refusing to decide, which was not the same as failing to act. It was all those things. A slightly open lid is still a box. A decision deferred indefinitely is still a refusal to decide. A man who plans to speak and does not speak has, after enough time, made his decision by default, and the decision he has made is silence. I understood this on some level at 32, when Aldrich's engagement ended, and I did not call at Brackenhollow for 4 months. I understood it at 35, when I was walking towards Cecily's gate in November and turned back before I reached it. I understood it at 31, if I am being entirely honest, in the library the night after the Aldenmere party when Aldrich and Cecily's engagement was announced, when I sat in the dark and let the decade I had been about to waste become the decade I was wasting. Understanding and acting are not the same thing. That is perhaps the most important thing I have learned in 41 years, and I learned it by doing the long version of not learning it. The morning ended differently from how I expected, or rather, it ended as I had been without knowing it, hoping it might for a very long time. And here I am in the library, with the fire and the evening and Cecily's voice through the door, and the 3 weeks, and whatever comes after. There was a midsummer gathering at the Aldenmere estate in June of 1820 that I remember with particular clarity, and I have returned to it often in the years since, because it is the occasion on which I came closest to understanding what I was doing not intellectually, not with the theoretical understanding I had been carrying for several years, but in the physical, specific, undeniable way that you understand something when the body receives it before the mind has finished arguing. The gathering was larger than the usual Aldenmere affairs. Lady Aldenmere had invited several families from adjacent counties, augmenting the usual county circle with 6 guests who were unknown to most of us, and the Aldenmere grounds, which were arranged around a formal garden with a considerable lawn and a ha-ha on the southern side, were opened for the occasion. It was a warm evening, the kind of warm that arrives in June when the summer is actually going to be summer rather than merely attempting it. And there was food laid on the terrace and musicians in the east garden, and the county's families moving through both spaces in the light way of people who are outdoors in summer and do not have to be indoors. Cecily was there with Edmund, who had a cousin among the visiting families from Worcestershire and was in a particularly good humor. I had arrived early, for reasons I did not examine, and I had stationed myself in the area between the terrace and the formal garden in a position from which the approaches from the gate were visible, also for reasons I did not examine. I saw her arrive. She was wearing a pale gray dress that I had seen once before at the Aldenmere winter gathering 2 years previously, and which suited her in the specific way that things suit people who have chosen them because they are right rather than because they are fashionable. She was with Edmund, and she was already talking to him about something, gesturing slightly in the characteristic way that meant she was explaining something to him that he had misunderstood in an interesting direction. Edmund was redirected almost immediately toward his Worcestershire cousin, which left Cecily standing at the edge of the terrace with a glass of lemonade, looking at the garden with the focused, absorbing attention she brought to physical spaces, as though the garden were a text she was reading carefully. I walked over. Aldenmere has improved the west bed since last year, she said, when I reached her without turning around. She had apparently seen my approach in the same peripheral way I had been monitoring hers. He brought in a head gardener from Bath, I said. In March. She turned to look at the bed in question, which was a long border of late spring plants just coming into their early summer arrangement. The man from Bath knows what he's doing, she said. The color sequence is very good. He's managing the timing well. You could tell him that, I said. I'll introduce you. She looked at me with a brief quality of amusement. I don't think the head gardener of Aldenmere requires the assessment of the woman who manages the kitchen garden at Brackenhollow. The head gardener of Aldenmere, I said, is a craftsman who cares about his work. In my experience, craftsmen who care about their work find the assessments of people who understand the work interesting regardless of the scale of the operation they're assessing. She looked at me for a moment. Then, you know this because you spend a great deal of time with craftsmen. I know this because Griggs told me once that the most useful criticism of the wall repair came from a woman he'd never met before who looked at the abutment for 30 seconds and identified the problem he'd been arguing about with his apprentice for 2 days. She was quiet for a moment. Was that conversation about me? She said. Yes, I said. I told him who you were afterward, and he said he'd known there was something in you the moment he saw you look at the axle in the lane. She looked at me. The look was the one, the gray eyes looking at me with that quality of attention that was also the quality of evaluation, the specific look I had been cataloging for 5 years. Then she turned back to the west bed. "The man from Bath has done something very clever with the geraniums," she said. "He's run a line of deep pink behind the whites rather than mixing them, which is the conventional approach. It makes both colors stronger." We stood at the edge of the terrace for perhaps 20 minutes, looking at the garden, talking about the planting and about what was happening in the east garden and about the Aldenmere ha-ha, which was an old one and showing its age. The evening was warm around us. The sound of the musicians came from the east garden and mixed with the general sound of a large party in an outdoor space in June voices, movement, the occasional laugh, the high clear note of a child somewhere in the south lawn. At some point Lady Aldenmere came to find us, with the particular expression she wore when she had a social purpose. "You have been monopolizing my terrace," she said, with the warmth of a woman who is not actually objecting. "We have been looking at your west bed," I said, "which is excellent." Lady Aldenmere looked pleased. "Dunmore has been very diligent," she said. Dunmore was apparently the man from Bath. "He understands about the color sequence in a way that the previous man never did." "Miss Vane was just observing that the arrangement of the geraniums is particularly successful," I said. Lady Aldenmere looked at Cecily, and then she looked at me, and the look she gave us in that moment was the look that Lady Aldenmere gave things when she had arrived at a conclusion. "Very good," she said. "Will you come and meet the Worcesters? They have been asking to be introduced to the county." She led Cecily off into the party, and I stood on the terrace alone for a moment, looking at the west bed and the evening and the party beyond it. And I understood, in the specific physical way I was speaking of, that I was in love with her in a way that was not going to change, was not going to diminish, was not going to resolve into something more manageable through patience or time or the natural attrition of strong feeling. I understood this not because I arrived at a logical conclusion, but because I felt it in the way that one feels physical things as a fact of the body, present and real and not arguable. I stood on the terrace for perhaps 2 minutes, holding this understanding, and then I went to find her in the party. She was with the Worcesters and Edmund and Lady Aldenmere, and the conversation was general, and I joined it and managed the evening and went home. And did not speak again. In the autumn of 1819, after Cecily had returned from Bath and the county had settled back into its familiar pattern, there was a gathering at the Penwick estate that I remember with a particular kind of sharpness. Lord Penwick had died that spring, leaving the estate to his nephew, who was not yet in residence, and his widow, a quiet woman of considerable dignity who had managed the house with grace for 30 years, was hosting her last gathering before the estate passed to the new heir, and she moved to her dower property in Wiltshire. It was a valedictory occasion, with the particular quality that such occasions have. Everyone present was aware that what they were attending was also a leave-taking, and this awareness gave the evening a gentleness that it might not otherwise have had. Lady Penwick received her guests with the warmth of a woman who is saying goodbye to a long chapter of her life, and doing so with complete dignity, and the guests responded in kind, more attentive than usual, more careful, as though the evening were a thing to be held and not just inhabited. Cecily and I found each other, in the way we always found each other at gatherings, near the east window of the drawing-room about 20 minutes into the evening. She had been speaking with Lady Penwick and with one of the visitors from the adjacent county, and there was something in her expression when she came toward the window, something she had not entirely composed, yet from whatever the previous conversation had produced. "Lady Penwick showed me the garden," she said when she reached me. "The famous garden," I said. Penwick had a formal garden that was considered one of the finest in the county, and which the late Lord Penwick had managed with personal involvement. "She showed me the rose borders," Cecily said. "She told me which ones Lord Penwick had planted himself, and which the head gardener had been responsible for, and which had come from cuttings from her own family's garden before her marriage." She paused. "She told me which rose he had planted the year she was born, as a gift for her birth, her father." She was looking at the garden through the east window, which was dark now except for the lights along the terrace path. She had the expression she rarely had, an expression that was not the usual composed directness, but something more open, something that belonged to the register of things that mattered rather than things that were interesting. "It's a very old garden," I said. "Yes," she said. "She said she has been walking in it for 40 years, and she knows every plant in it, and she doesn't know how to walk away from it." We were quiet for a moment. The sounds of the gathering continued around us. "I think of the kitchen garden like that sometimes," she said. "Not that it is old, it is 4 years old, but I know it. I know every bed and what it has produced and what it is capable of producing and what is wrong with it and what is going to be right with it in 2 more seasons." She looked at me. "I don't know if that sounds eccentric." "It sounds like understanding," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. Then, "Lady Penwick said that the hardest part of leaving will not be the house, which is after all only a house, or the garden, which is after all only a garden, but the particular quality of a life that has been lived entirely in one place. The way a place accumulates the texture of a life lived in it." "She has lived there for 40 years?" I said. "Yes," said Cecily, "she has." She looked at the window again. "I sometimes think about what the kitchen garden will be when it is 40 years old. What texture it will have accumulated." I looked at her. She was 27 years old, standing at the east window of Penwick's drawing room, talking about what a kitchen garden would be in 40 years. And in the specific way she was talking about it, not as a hypothetical but as a thing she could see. A thing she intended there was something that was both an invitation and not an invitation, something that was available to be taken up, and that she was not pressing me to take up. I did not take it up. I said something about the quality of old gardens and the way accumulation worked in any discipline that was practiced with consistency over time. She agreed. We talked about other things. The evening continued. In the carriage going home alone this time, not with Aldrich. Aldrich was long gone from the county by then. I thought about what she had said. The kitchen garden when it was 40 years old. The texture of a life lived entirely in one place. She had been talking, I understood now, in the specifically precise and entirely unforced way that Cecily talked about things that mattered, about home. About the kind of home that is made rather than inherited. About what it would be like to be in a place for 40 years and know every bed of it. She had been talking about wanting, in the most concrete and specific and undramatic terms she could find, the thing she had been managing in a box. I understood this on the evening of the Penwick gathering, sitting alone in the carriage on the dark road home. I understood it with complete clarity, the specific clarity that arrives at moments like that, when the evidence has finally arranged itself beyond the point of reasonable misreading. And I went home, and I sat in the library, and I told myself I would speak in the spring. The spring of 1820 passed, the summer of 1820 passed, the midsummer gathering came and went, the autumn came. She was 28. I want to describe one more specific occasion from those years, because it is the one that has most specifically shaped what I am doing now, the writing of this account, the specific quality of honesty I am trying to bring to it. It is the occasion of the Aldenmere winter gathering of 1820, December, which was a larger and more formal affair than Lady Aldenmere's usual events, with the full complement of county families and several visitors, and a supper that went on rather long, and a drawing-room that was very warm from the fire, and the number of people, and the particular concentration of candlelight that Lady Aldenmere required for her large gatherings. The occasion was the occasion of my first real self-deception, which is to say, the occasion when I said something to myself that I knew was false, and said it anyway, deliberately, as a means of continuing to not do the thing I was not doing. What happened was this. I was standing near the south wall of the drawing-room after supper, talking to Reverend Cornwall, who was by this point a genuine social ally, a man I liked, and whose company I found genuinely interesting about the question of whether a man could be said to love something he had never expressed the love of. It was a philosophical question of the kind that Cornwall liked, not abstract but grounded in a specific case that he was considering from a pastoral perspective. One of his parishioners, an elderly man who had been widowed many years before and who had never, apparently, told his wife that he loved her, but whose grief at her loss was so comprehensive and genuine that it could not be doubted. I said, I think love unexpressed is still love. It is perhaps love poorly managed, but it is the same thing. Cornwall said he was inclined to agree, but was troubled by the question of what the beloved person loses when the love is not expressed, whether there is something in the expression itself that is part of what the love does in the world. I said, the beloved person loses, at minimum, the certainty. They may have the sense of the thing, the evidence of it in small actions and consistent attention, but they don't have the certainty. Cornwall said, and certainty matters. Certainty matters, I said. And at some point in this conversation, I became aware that Cecily was nearby, not in conversation with me, not directed toward me, but in the group of people standing at the fireplace perhaps 15 feet away, and close enough to the wall where Cornwall and I were standing that it was not impossible she could hear some of what we were saying, if she were attending. I looked at her. She was not looking at me. She was talking to Lady Penwick's daughter about something, animated, her hands moving in the way they moved when she was explaining something she cared about. She was not attending to my conversation. But in the moment of looking at her and saying certainty matters into a conversation that was specifically about love not expressed and what the beloved person loses when it is not, I said to myself, she doesn't hear this. She doesn't know this is about her, and it doesn't matter because I will tell her. I will tell her in the spring. I knew, even as I said this to myself, that it was false. Not in the sense that I wouldn't tell her I might, but in the sense that the telling I was promising myself was the same telling I had been promising myself for 5 years, and that the promise was a management strategy rather than a genuine intention, and that I knew the difference and was choosing to use the word intention anyway. That was the moment I am talking about. The first conscious, deliberate self-deception. The spring of 1821, and I had been in love with her for 6 years. I tell this because the account is the honest one, and because the honest one is the only one worth telling, and because I think the shape of what I was doing, the way the fear became self-deception, and the self-deception became a kind of comfortable permanence, is the shape that produces, over a decade, the morning I had this morning. And the morning I had this morning is the shape that produced everything that is true this evening. She is in the drawing room. I can hear her voice. The fire is burning well. The list is complete. In some reasonable number of minutes, the evening will simply be the evening. I am going to close this account now, not because it is finished. The complete account of what was between us in the years before today would fill more pages than I have time to fill. And the complete account of what is between us in the years that are coming is not mine to write yet, only to live, but because the recording of it has served its purpose, which is to make the shape of it visible, to see it plain. What it is plain is this. A woman with gray eyes in a muddy lane in October of 1815, who looked at me with the direct, unconstructed attention of someone who was thinking about what she was looking at rather than about what the looking looked like. 10 years of finding reasons not to say the thing that was plainly true. A morning badly timed and entirely necessary, in which the thing was finally said. A kitchen garden path in November, with frost on the ground and a woman in a gray coat who had loved me for 10 years, and managed it into a box, and opened the box when the truth came through the door. Hers and mine and 3 weeks, and the 22nd of November, and all the ordinary days after that. There is one more thing I want to set down before I put the pen away, and it is about the morning, not the 5 o'clock part of the morning, which I have described at length, but the hour between 5 and the time she came to the kitchen garden path, which was the hour I spent at home. I have said I sat in the library. I have said the morning made itself outside the window. Both of these things are true, but they do not describe the quality of that hour, which was unlike anything I have experienced, including the hours before Salamanca. What it was like was this: I was entirely without the future. Not in the desperate sense, not in the sense of someone who believes they have no future, but in the simple sense that the future, that endlessly available landscape that I had been arranging and rearranging for 10 years, the future in which I would speak, the future in which the occasion would arrive, the future in which the right moment would finally present itself, was simply gone. There was no more future. The future had, at 5 o'clock in the morning in a white rose hallway, become the past. I had done the thing had been done. What came next was out of my hands entirely, which is to say it was in Cecily's hands, which is, I have concluded, probably the best place for consequential things to be. The quality of that hour without the future, without the planning, without the composing of speeches, and the imagining of responses was very quiet. Not peaceful, because peace implies a settled kind of quiet, and this was not settled. but very quiet, empty of the specific noise that had been filling the chest for 10 years, which was the noise of the unsaid thing vibrating against its container. The thing had been said, the container was empty. And I sat in the library and watched the frost on the fields catch the early light. And I did not plan anything, and I did not compose anything, and I waited, in the specific way of a person who has finally done the only thing there was to do and is now genuinely at the mercy of what comes next. What came next was a knock at the kitchen garden side door at 9:20, and Cecily in the frost in the gray coat with the walking boots. I want to describe one more specific thing about that moment, which is this. When I opened the door and saw her there, the first thing I saw before her face, before the gray coat, before the properly pinned hair, was her breath in the cold air. The specific small cloud of her breath in the November morning, which told me that she had been breathing fast, which told me the frost on the toe of the boot was not an accident. She had come quickly. She had made the decision, and she had come quickly, and the breath in the cold air was the evidence of it. I have held that image for the whole of today. The frost on the boot, the breath in the cold air, the gray eyes meeting mine when she looked up, all of it evidence. All of it the things that are true before the words, the things that the body carries when the decision has been made and the person is moving toward the consequence of it. She is in the drawing room. In a little while the evening will be over and tomorrow will begin, and the practical matters of the next 3 weeks will take the shape of a specific November, and then the 22nd, and then the church, and then all the days after. But right now it is still the evening of the 1st, and the fire is burning well, and I have written what I came to write, and the pen is going down. Tomorrow I will speak to Marchfield about the settlements. Tomorrow Pemberton will coordinate with the Brackenhollow household about the announcement. Tomorrow Harriet will be somewhat less exercised about the roses. Tomorrow Edmund will be thinking about something else entirely, which is simply his nature and does not require correction. And in 3 weeks we will stand in the village church, and I will say the things that are said in village churches, and she will say the same things. And then it will be the 22nd, and then it will be the 23rd, and then it will be December, and then it will be the years. The years that I have been, without quite knowing it, waiting for. I have been waiting for years of walking to a kitchen door in the August morning with earth on her hands, and the easy silence of 2 people who are entirely themselves together. I have been waiting for years of lists and practical arrangements, and the specific cadence of a voice, through a door, working through the necessary things efficiently. I have been waiting for years of arguments about hedgerows and Italian grammar and the management of north beds and soil composition, and for the years of the real laugh that is not for anyone, and for the years of the gray eyes looking at me with that direct, unconstructed quality of attention that was the first thing I fell in love with, in the lane, before I had any words for what I was falling into. I have been waiting for all of it, and in 3 weeks it begins. In the meantime, the fire and the evening and her voice through the door and the pen set down. The fire is very good, the evening is very quiet. I am going to put down the pen and go into the drawing room and be in the ordinary way of the evening with the woman I have been in love with for 10 years, without managing it, without the lid, without the box. Without the fear. The courage has been hers. I am going to borrow some of it, starting now. In the late summer of 1821, there was a morning at Brackenhollow that I have thought about more than almost any other single moment in the 10 years, and that I am going to describe now because describing it is the only way to account for why it was also the morning when I came closest, and also the morning I failed most completely. I had ridden out early before 8 o'clock on the matter of the hedge, the long-running practical negotiation about the shared boundary hedge, which had been through 3 or 4 iterations of consultation by that point, and was not yet resolved. Brackenhollow's side of the hedge had begun showing signs of failure in the north section, which was partly a maintenance matter, and partly a question of how the hedge had been originally planted, 30 years ago, in a pattern that was not well suited to the soil on that edge of the property. I arrived to find the household awake, but Edmund not yet present. He had been unwell the previous week, and was keeping late mornings by doctor's advice. Cecily met me in the hall with the direct, practical manner she always had when there was work to be done, wearing a linen dress and an apron she had clearly been wearing in the garden, with earth on her hands from something she had been doing before I arrived. "The north section of the hedge," she said by way of greeting. Yes, I said. Shall we look at it? We walked out to the hedge. The morning was warm and clear, late August, the fields around Brackenhollow in the last rich stage before harvest, the air carrying the specific smell of late summer that is partly warmth and partly the beginning of something changing. The north section of the hedge was indeed showing the failure I had been told about, a 20-foot stretch where the growth had become thin and ragged, with gaps in the lower structure that would, if left, become genuine holes by the following spring. We looked at it together, in the way we had looked at things together for 6 years side by side, with the shared attention of two people who both know something about the thing in front of them and are comparing their knowledge. She pointed out where the root system was compromised. I pointed out the section where the damage was coming from the drainage pattern on the Hartwell side, rather than from anything to do with the hedge's own management. We discussed the options: patch planting, which would solve the immediate problem but not the structural one, or a fuller replanting of the north section, which would mean a gap in the boundary for 2 seasons while the new plant's established. The replanting, she said, after we had walked the length of the section twice. The patch planting is a temporizing measure. The root problem will simply produce the same failure 5 years from now in the adjacent sections. Agreed, I said. The replanting will mean a livestock fence on both sides for 2 seasons. That's manageable, she said. Griggs can price the fencing. We stood for a moment at the end of the north section, looking back along it. The morning was very quiet except for the birds. Edmund was somewhere in the house, sleeping in on Doctor's advice. The kitchen garden was visible over the stable roof, very green in the August light. The greenhouse extension is working well, I said, because we had been talking about the extension the previous time we met, and the current state of it was a natural next topic. Better than I expected, she said. The cucumbers are still producing, which they should not be in late August in this county. The French bean is more variable. I think the ventilation is not quite right on the east side. The east side of what? The extension. The frame I built in the spring, the ventilation on the east panel lets in too much of the afternoon heat in July and August. The beans don't like it. What would correct it? A different angle on the panel, she said. About 15 degrees. I have been thinking about how to adjust it without taking the whole structure apart, and I think there is a way, but it will require Griggs. Griggs can look at the hedge fence and the greenhouse panel at the same time, I said. That's efficient, she said, with the tone she used for things that were efficient, a note of genuine satisfaction. We turned and walked back toward the house. The walk was perhaps 200 yards, along the lane and then up the path toward the kitchen door. And it was the ordinary walk of 2 people who have been looking at a practical matter together and are returning from it. And it was also, and I am trying to be as honest as I can about this, one of the most quietly significant 200 yards I have walked in my life. Because what it was, underneath the practical matter and the hedge assessment and the greenhouse ventilation, was simply this. We were walking together across her property in the early morning, in easy, comfortable silence, with the birds and the August air and the green of the kitchen garden over the stable roof, and it was entirely natural. There was nothing managed about it, nothing performed, nothing requiring either of us to be anything other than exactly who we were. She had earth on her hands from the garden, and I had been up since 6, and neither of us had made the slightest effort to produce an occasion, or to be impressive, or to be anything except 2 people who had been looking at a hedge together and were now walking back. That was the thing. That was the morning. Not a declaration, not a significant moment of any kind that I could have pointed to from the outside. Simply the most ordinary possible version of being with someone, the hedge and the walk and the earth on her hands and the August air. I understood, walking those 200 yards in easy silence, that this was what I wanted for the rest of my life. Not the declared version, not the formal and ceremonious version, not the version with the speech and the occasion and the careful preparation. This, the hedge and the easy silence and the earth on her hands from the early morning garden. And I did not speak. I want to be very clear about what I mean when I say I did not speak. I do not mean that I was not going to speak, or that I had not decided to speak, or that the occasion was not right. I mean that we arrived at the kitchen door and she thanked me for coming and said she would send word to Griggs, and I said I would do the same, and she looked at me for a moment with the gray eyes and I looked at her, and then I went home. I went home and I sat in the library and I thought about the walk and the silence and the earth on her hands and the August air, and I thought, this is what I want. And I thought, I am not going to say so until the right moment. And I thought, the right moment is the thing I have been waiting for since October of 1815, and I am still waiting for it. And then I did not speak for 4 more years. 4 more years. She was 29 that August morning. I waited 4 more years. I am not going to dress this up differently than it was. I waited 4 more years, and in those 4 years she went to Bath and came back and let Geoffrey Marchmont court her and made the sensible decision of a woman who has been waiting in her specific way for too long and has decided to stop. And this morning I went to her house at 5 o'clock and said the thing. The thing that I should have said on a warm August morning in 1821, walking 200 yards from a hedge assessment to a kitchen door. Let me say it one more time, clearly and without any further management of how it sounds. I wasted 4 more years. After the August morning in 1821, after the Penwick gathering in 1819, after the Midsummer gathering in 1820, after every gathering and walk and conversation in the 9 years between October of 1815 and October of 1824. I wasted all of them, one by one, each one a small refusal that accumulated into the large refusal that was a decade of silence. And the woman who was the recipient of that silence had enough practicality and enough courage and enough honest self-knowledge to put the feeling in a box and close the lid and live her life. And then to open the box this morning when the truth finally presented itself, and come to the kitchen garden path in the gray coat at the pace indicated by the frost on the toe of the boot. That is everything, that is the whole shape of it. I am going to close this account now, not because there is nothing left to say, there is always more to say about 10 years of anything, but because the recording has served its purpose. I see the shape of it. The shape is clear. In 3 weeks it will be November again. In 3 weeks I will stand in the village church with Cecily Vane, and we will say what we should have said in October of 1815. And then it will be November the 23rd, and December, and the New Year, and all the months after that. I want to say something about Edmund Vane, because Edmund deserves more than the role of comic background that I have given him in this account. He is a good man. I have said this before, but I want to say it more specifically now, as the evening is winding down and he is in the drawing room with his daughter, and I am sitting here with the pen in my hand. Edmund Vane spent 40 years of his life making financial decisions that a man of better judgment would not have made. He lost money that could not be recovered. He put his family in a position of genuine difficulty that his eldest surviving daughter managed on his behalf for the better part of a decade, because she was the one with the capacity and the presence to manage it, and she did not make him feel the full weight of that. She did not make him feel it because she loved him, and because she is the kind of person who does not use the help she gives as a means of establishing a debt. She helped him because he needed it, and because she could, and the manner of the help was the same matter-of-fact practicality that she brings to everything, with no performance of sacrifice and no accumulation of resentment that I could ever identify. Edmund, for his part, has been a man of genuine warmth and genuine love for his daughters, within the limits of his capacity. He noticed things I said this earlier about the fence, and it was true. He noticed the visits and had drawn the right conclusion about them long before the morning. He held me, I think, with a kind of tentative hope for some years, a hope that my visits might resolve into something, without ever pushing or asking or attempting to engineer, because engineering was not his quality. He was content to hope, and to leave the engineering, as he left most practical matters, to the people in his life who had the aptitude for it. He is going to be my father-in-law in 3 weeks. I have spent 10 years in his drawing room. I know him in the specific way that one knows a person you have spent regular time with over a long period, without the relationship having any particular formal content. He has talked to me about his schemes, and I have listened, and I have never invested in any of them, but neither have I discouraged him with the bluntness that would have been unkind. We have reached a comfortable mutual arrangement of his enthusiasm and my polite interest. I am going to spend the rest of my life as his son-in-law, which means I am going to spend the rest of my life as one of the people who is in a position to say, gently, clearly, with the respect owed to a man of his age and his genuine good nature, Edmund, this particular scheme is not one I would recommend. I am going to be, in other words, one of the people who can help protect him from himself, not by managing his finances without his knowledge, which was always an unsatisfying solution, for all that it was necessary, but by being present and honest in a way that a man in my position and his can be honest with each other. He deserves that. He deserves someone to be honest with him in a way that respects his dignity and his genuine good nature, and I think I can do that, and I think Cecily will be glad of the help. When I went to speak with him this afternoon, after the kitchen garden and after Cecily's conversation with Harriet had settled into something workable, he sat across from me in the Bracken Hollow drawing room and listened to what I said with the kind of attention he brought to all genuinely important things, complete, focused, without the scattered quality that his mind had when it was occupied with schemes. He said, when I had finished, "I have always thought you were calling here too often about the fence." And then he said, "I am glad it is you. I am glad it is you." 4 words, simply said, by a man who has known me for 10 years and who loves his daughter more than anything else in his life, and who has the particular graceful honesty that comes from good nature uncomplicated by calculation. I am glad it is you. I am going to carry that. The fire is good. The evening is quiet. Her voice is audible through the door, clear and direct, managing the last of the day's arrangements with the competence that is her natural mode. I love her, I have told her so. I intend to tell her every day. I am going to go in now. I am 41 years old. I am writing this account in the library at Hartwell on the evening of the 1st of November, 1825, which is the day I finally said what I should have said in October of 1815. The arithmetic of this is not comfortable. I have been in love with Cecily Vane for 10 years, and I said so for the first time this morning at 5 o'clock in the hall of her family's house, surrounded by white roses intended for her wedding to another man. There is a particular quality to the self-knowledge that produces a document like this one. It is not the comfortable kind of self-knowledge, the kind that allows a person to say, "I understand my own weakness, and understanding it makes me a better person." It is the kind that simply shows you what you did plainly, without flattery or excuse. I did not speak for 10 years. The reasons I did not speak were real fear, uncertainty, the various architectural failures of timing and occasion that I have described. They were also insufficient. They were insufficient because the thing that was on the other side of speaking was worth the fear, and I knew it, and I let the fear be larger than the knowledge anyway. I do not know how to undo this. I know only that the morning happened as it happened, and that she came to the kitchen garden path, and that the rest is beginning. Let me describe the kitchen garden path more fully, because I have mentioned it several times and have not said everything that was true about it. I went home from Brackenhollow after the 5 o'clock declaration with the specific feeling of a man who has done an irreversible thing, and does not know yet whether the irreversibility is going to resolve in his favor. The morning was very quiet, November quiet, the particular stillness of a late autumn morning when the frost is on the fields, and the light is low, and everything is held in a kind of suspended waiting that the season produces naturally. I rode home through it with the feeling of the words still present in my chest, not diminished by having been said, but changed in quality, no longer weight, but something more like exposure. The words had been in the chest for 10 years, and now they were out in the air of the world, and the world was going to do something with them that I had no control over. I went to the library. Pemberton came at 8 with the post and a look that required no comment from either of us. He brought coffee. He managed the morning's correspondence without requiring my attention on anything. He was, as he has always been, excellent. The clock moved. At 7 o'clock the frost on the eastern fields was catching the early light in the particular way that November frost catches low light, not with warmth, but with a kind of brightness that is specific to cold, the brightness of reflection rather than absorption. I watched it from the library window and thought about the kitchen garden at Brackenhollow, which would have the same frost on it, and Cecily, who had looked at me from the stairs and said, "Go home, I will send word," and who was somewhere in the house making the decision that the rest of everything depended on. At 8 o'clock, I attempted to read the parliamentary correspondence that had arrived in the Morning Post, and found I could not attend to any of it. I set it aside. At 9 o'clock, Pemberton came in with a second pot of coffee and said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided something is not his business, but wants to be useful anyway, "The kitchen garden path is visible from the south window of the morning room, if you prefer a different view." I looked at him. "Thank you, Pemberton," I said. "I'll stay here." "Very good," he said and withdrew. At 9:20, the knock came. I was at the door before the knock had fully finished. The side entrance, the kitchen garden path, the frost, the gray coat. She was there. And what I have not said and want to say is this. She had frost on her boots. Not on the sole or the heel where frost accumulates when you walk through it, but also on the toe, which is where it accumulates when you have been walking fast and your foot is coming down at an angle. She had walked from Brackenhollow at a pace that was faster than a deliberate stroll. She had made the decision, and she had come quickly, and the frost on the toe of her boot was the evidence of it. This is the specific detail I have been returning to all afternoon. Not the words, though the words were everything, and I have said so, but the frost on the toe of the boot. Because the frost on the toe of the boot was the answer to the question of what she had done in her 10 minutes, which was, she had decided and she had come, without hesitating, at a pace that was not a deliberate walk but a purposeful one, and the frost had gathered on the toe of the boot in the evidence of it. She had been loving me for 10 years, more than somewhat, into a box, and when the box was finally opened, the first thing she did was walk fast across the frost. She stood in the kitchen garden path, and she said what she said, and I said what I said, and I held her cold hands in my warm ones, and she laughed the real laugh when I said I intended to be not at all subtle about the love for the rest of our lives, and then we went inside. Everything after that has been the practical consequence of the morning. Edmund and Harriet and Geoffrey, and the church, and the announcement, and the list, and the 3 weeks. All of it real, all of it consequential, all of it necessary. The practical consequence of a morning is always this: a great deal of arrangement, a great deal of management, a great deal of the ordinary machinery of life turning over to accommodate a new fact. Cecily has managed all of it today with the same competence she manages everything, which is to say with clarity and economy, and the particular willingness to make decisions and live in the consequences of them that I have been finding essential in her for 10 years. She is not afraid of consequences. This is the thing. She made the decision in her 10 minutes, and she came down the kitchen garden path, and she said what she said, and she has been managing the consequences since 9:30 this morning with the same energy she manages everything. She is not afraid of having done it. She has been sorry about Geoffrey, and she has acknowledged Harriet's concerns, and she has been practical and clear-headed about everything that has needed to be practical and clear-headed. But she is not afraid. She has never, in my observation over 10 years, been afraid of the right thing. She has been sensible about it and practical about it, and sometimes resigned to the impossibility of it, but not afraid. The fear has been mine. The fear has been exclusively, entirely mine for the whole 10 years, and the courage has been hers. This is what I understand on the evening of the 1st of November, 1825, in the library at Hartwell, with the fire burning well and the evening dark outside, and Cecily in the drawing-room managing Harriet and Edmund and the practical arrangements of 3 weeks and what comes after. The courage has been hers all along, including the courage to make the choice this morning, which cost her Geoffrey Marchmont's feelings and Harriet's composure and a great deal of practical difficulty, and which she made clearly and executed completely within the span of a morning, without uncertainty and without apology for the decision itself, only for the difficulty it caused others. I am going to spend the rest of my life endeavoring to be as unafraid as she is. I am not confident I will succeed, because the pattern of 10 years is not overturned in a morning, and the habit of fear is precisely a habit it persists. But I am going to endeavor. 3 weeks. 20 minutes. Then the rest. She comes back into the library with the list finished and a different expression on her face, lighter, the specific lightness of a person who has managed the necessary things and is now done managing for the evening. She sits in the chair across from the desk, not in the way of someone who has business to conduct, but in the way of someone who has come to be in a room. We sit in the library together for a while, in the comfortable quiet that has always been possible between us, that has always been one of the things I was not acknowledging that I loved. Outside, the November evening is dark and cold, and the frost is forming again on the fields. In 3 weeks it will be November again, and we will stand in the village church and say what we should have said 10 years ago. And then it will be the 23rd, and the 24th, and December, and all the months after that, each one its own day, each day the ordinary kind, the kind that is not story but life. The kind I have been waiting for. There was a conversation at the Aldenmere estate in the spring of 1818 that I have never quite been able to set aside, for reasons I have thought about often in the years since. It occurred at one of Lady Aldenmere's regular spring gatherings, which were the most formal of her seasonal events, and which she organized with considerable attention to the arrangement of her guests, seating them at supper and positioning them in the drawing room with the specific intention of producing the social outcomes she had determined would be beneficial. She was, in this capacity, both generous and imperious, and the county submitted to her arrangements because, as a practical matter, she was very often right about what would benefit whom. On this particular spring evening, she had arranged that Cecily and I should be seated together at supper. This was not always the case. The positioning varied, and was governed by considerations of conversational balance and social diplomacy that Lady Aldenmere managed with an internal calculator I had never been able to fully decode. But on this evening we were seated together at the end of the table nearest the window, which was the end that caught the last of the spring evening light, and we were four at that end. Cecily and I, and on the other side the Reverend Cornwall, who was the new incumbent at the Hartwell village church and who had been in the county for less than a year, and his wife, who was pleasant and somewhat reserved. The Reverend Cornwall, it emerged quickly, had been educated at Cambridge, where he had read classics and developed strong opinions about the translation of Virgil, which was a subject in which Cecily had opinions of her own. They discovered this within the first 5 minutes, and for the next 20 the conversation at our end of the table was almost entirely about whether a recent new translation of the eclogues had succeeded in conveying the pastoral quality of the original, or had produced something that read, as Cecily put it with characteristic directness, like a man who has read about fields rather than a man who has ever stood in one. The Reverend Cornwall laughed at this. He was a man who could laugh at a good point even when it was made against a position he held, which is not common, and which in this case was the position that the translation in question had particular merit. He defended it. She pressed the objection. I contributed, having read both the translation and substantial portions of the original in Florence, and the exchange became the kind of lively, good-faith argument that good dinner company produces, and that Lady Aldenmere, at the other end of the table, appeared to view with satisfaction when she glanced our way. After supper, when the company moved to the drawing-room, Cecily and I found ourselves briefly in a corner near the fireplace, apart from the main conversation, in the 2 or 3 minutes that occur at such transitions when people are still redistributing themselves and have not yet settled into the evening's second configuration. She said, "Cornwall is good company." "He is," I said. "An unusual combination, a classicist with practical sense." "The argument about the eclogues was worth having," she said. She looked into the fire for a moment. "I don't often have arguments worth having." "You have them with me," I said. She looked at me. There was a quality in the look that I have described before and will describe again, because it was the thing I kept encountering with Cecily. A look that was both direct and somehow deeper than its surface, a look that seemed to be registering more than it disclosed. "Yes," she said, "I do." And then the drawing room settled into its configuration, and others joined us, and the conversation became general, and nothing more was said. But the look and the 2 syllables stayed with me, the way that small, specific things stay with a person who is paying the kind of attention I was paying. I went home from the Aldenmere spring gathering of 1818 and sat in the library and told myself again that I would speak, that the ground was clearly there, that the look and the yes I do were not nothing, were something, were evidence. That patience had already gone on long enough, and the right moment was not going to be better than the moment that was available. I told myself this for 3 weeks and did not speak. The summer of 1818 was a good summer for the county, which had 2 consecutive difficult summers before it, and for the Bracken Hollow kitchen garden specifically, which produced the largest yield Cecily had achieved since taking it over. She sold 3 times her usual surplus at the market, at the slightly better prices that I had arranged, and which I was fairly certain she had by that point half suspected, based on a remark she made at the Aldenmere summer gathering about the market's behavior being somewhat puzzling and somewhat welcome. I said nothing about this. The arrangement had been in place for over a year by then, and disrupting it by confessing it was a matter I was not ready to address, because the confession of the arrangement would require explanation, and the explanation would necessarily reference what the arrangement had been in lieu of, which was the declaration I had not made. The autumn of 1818 brought the Italian lessons, and Cecily's expanding expertise as an instructor, which I found myself hearing about with a warmth that was partly admiration for what she was doing, and partly the particular warmth that comes from hearing about the daily life of someone you love, the ordinary texture of their days, the things they found difficult, and the things they found rewarding. The vicar's eldest daughter was struggling with the subjunctive mood, and Cecily had developed an approach to teaching it that used examples from Dante rather than from the grammar's abstract exercises, on the grounds that seeing the mood in genuine literary use was more memorable than seeing it in constructed sentences. She had also found that the younger daughters learned more quickly from watching their elder sister work through a difficulty than from working through the same difficulty themselves. Teaching 3 people at different levels simultaneously is more complicated than I anticipated, she said, when she described this to me at a gathering in October of 1818. But it has the advantage of each level providing something useful to the others. The youngest watches the eldest work through things she doesn't yet encounter, and it prepares her differently than instruction alone would. The eldest is more careful when she knows the younger ones are observing, and the middle one benefits from being exactly in the middle, which is where she is naturally most comfortable. I asked about the middle one, whose name was Martha, and who was 10 years old and had, apparently, a very particular aptitude for the musical quality of Italian, for the sound of it, which she heard in a way that helped her retain vocabulary that others had to work harder for. Cecily talked about Martha for 5 minutes, about her aptitude, and about the best methods she had found for building on it, about the way that musical memory and linguistic memory appeared to operate similarly in certain kinds of minds, and about a technique she was considering for the following term. She was entirely absorbed in the subject, which was the way she was when she cared about something, the quality of attention becoming more concentrated, the speech becoming slightly quicker, the hands moving occasionally as she described something, a gesture toward a size or a shape or a quality. I was watching her, as I watched her every time she was in this state, with the particular quality of attention that I could not quite call ordinary looking. I was watching her the way a person watches a thing they love when they have decided not to say they love it. She looked up at me at some point and caught me watching, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and then she said, "I am going on about Martha." "No," I said, "go on about Martha." She looked at me for another moment. Then, "Well, Martha's difficulty at present is the distinction between formal and informal address, which she understands grammatically but has not yet internalized as a social register. She treats it as a rule rather than as a relationship." She went on about Martha, and I listened, and the autumn evening continued around us, and I went home with the specific kind of fullness that I had learned to associate with evenings in Cecily's company. Not happiness exactly, because happiness at that period was complicated by the fact that I was carrying something I was not saying, and carrying it was not comfortable, but something adjacent to happiness, something that was the presence of the thing itself, even when the thing itself was unacknowledged. In the winter of 1819, I began to compose the speech again. I had composed it before in my head, at night, in various versions that had accumulated over 3 years of composition and abandonment. This time I wrote it down. I sat at the desk in the library on a January evening and wrote it out, in my own hand, on a sheet of paper, in the way that one writes things when one is trying to find what they really are, underneath the accumulated revisions. What I wrote was this: that I had been in love with her since October of 1815, since a lane and a broken axle and a conversation about hedgerows, and that I had not said so, and that the not saying was the great failure of my adult life, and that I was telling her now. That I had no right to presuppose her feelings and was not doing so. That I was simply saying the thing because the thing was true and I could not carry it any longer without it being said. I wrote this out and read it several times and found that it said approximately what I wanted to say. Then I put it in the desk drawer and left it there for 3 days, and on the 4th day she went to bath, and I took the paper out of the drawer and put it in the fire. The bath period from April to July of 1819 was the period in which I most clearly understood what I had been doing. I understood it because her absence made the shape of what I had been doing visible in a way that her presence, paradoxically, had not. When she was in the county, there was always another gathering, Another occasion, another week in which the declaration might be made. The presence of a possible future kept the present tolerable. When she was in Bath, there was no gathering and no occasion and no possible week in which the declaration might be made, because she was not there, and the absence revealed what the presence had been obscuring, which was the fact that I had been living entirely in the possible future rather than in the actual present, and that the possible future was not the same as the actual future, and that the distance between them was exactly the size of the action I had not taken. I wrote to her twice while she was in Bath. Both letters were about practical matters: the hedge, a question about the compost approach she had described, a piece of agricultural news from the county that I thought she would find interesting. Neither letter said what I had been writing in the desk drawer and burning. I told myself the letters were appropriate, that a declaration made in writing to a woman who was visiting her cousin in Bath was not the right form, that these things were better done in person. This was true. It was also true that I had chosen, from the available options, the one that did not require me to say the thing. She came back in July, and by August I was settled again into the pattern of the county, the gatherings and the conversations and the look across the room, and the resolution to speak before winter had already begun to soften at its edges. She was 28, 29, 30. The winter of 1821 brought snow that lasted from December into February, which was unusual for Gloucestershire, and which altered the county's social patterns significantly. The roads were unreliable, the gatherings were reduced, and the county's families settled into the particular self-contained state that extended winter weather produces, each household managing its own company rather than the county's. I rode to Brackenhollow twice that winter, on days when the roads were passable, for reasons I have forgotten but which were adequate at the time. On the second occasion, in late January, I arrived to find Cecily in the drawing-room with a small fire and a very large book on natural history that she had apparently been working her way through with the methodical patience she brought to everything. She was marking passages in it with small slips of paper, in a system I had seen her use with other books, each slip corresponding to a subject category she had worked out. "What are you extracting from it?" I asked. "The botanical sections," she said. "There is a chapter on the management of plants in cold conditions that has implications for the glass structure, and there is a separate section on soil chemistry that I want to work through carefully. The man who wrote it is a German chemist, and the translation is not always clear, but when it is clear, it is very interesting." She showed me the section on soil chemistry. It was indeed interesting, a discussion of the relationship between soil acidity and the availability of nutrients to plant roots that was more rigorously argued than anything I had seen in the English agricultural literature. We spent 40 minutes on it together, she reading aloud the passages she had marked, and I contributing where the chemistry was clearer to me than to her, which was in the more technical sections, and she contributing where the agricultural application was clearer to her than to me, which was in most of the rest. Edmund Vane came in at some point during the 40 minutes, saw us at the book, said something pleasant, and went out again. He was very good at this. When I left that afternoon, Cecily walked with me to the door, which she did not always do. Sometimes the maid brought the coat, and the visit simply ended in the drawing-room. She walked with me to the door and said, as I was putting my coat on, "The German chemist has 2 more chapters on mineral composition that I haven't started yet, if you want to work through them." "I would," I said. "I'll send word when I've read far enough to know whether they're worth the time," she said. She sent word 3 weeks later. The word was a note of 4 lines, informative and precise, telling me that the chapters were in fact excellent and that she had worked through the first and would have views on the second when she had finished it. I went back to Brackenhollow for the 3rd time in February. We spent 3 hours on the German chemist and the mineral composition, and by the end of it we had arrived at a position on the management of the kitchen garden's north bed that was specifically derived from the chemistry, and that would, if she implemented it correctly in the spring, produce the improvement in yield she had been trying to achieve for 2 seasons. She implemented it in the spring. It worked exactly as predicted. She sent me a note in August that simply said, "The north bed is fully corrected. The German chemist was right about the phosphates. I will tell you what it produced when the season is finished." I read this note in my library and held it for a longer moment than the note required, and then I filed it with the other notes in the drawer, and I thought, "I'm going to speak before Christmas. And then I thought, I have been saying I am going to speak before Christmas for 4 years. And then I thought, yes. And the thought that followed was the one I had been having for 4 years, which was, but not yet. She was 30 when Geoffrey Marchmont arrived. And everything I have already said about the autumn of 1822, and the winter and the November gate is true, and the spring appointment with Pemberton is true, and Cecily's Thursday morning visit to Hartwell in April is true, and her sitting in the library chair with the tea is true. And I am 31 years old again, and she is saying I am 31, and she means it as a fact, and I hear it as the fact it is. I want to go back to that afternoon, the April afternoon, 6 months ago, because it is the one I keep returning to, the one that I believe, now that the day has resolved the way it has, was the last genuine occasion. She sat across from me in the library chair. We had talked for perhaps 20 minutes about Geoffrey, about the announcement, about what she hoped and what she thought. She had been honest, as she always is, about the quality of what she was choosing, not ebullient about it, not performing happiness, but describing it with the measured accuracy she brought to all assessments. Geoffrey was good. Geoffrey was kind. Geoffrey took her seriously. At one point she said, "He is interested in the kitchen garden. He came to see it last month. He had good questions." I looked at the fire. "I'm glad," I said. She looked at me. The gray eyes were very clear and very direct, and there was something in them that I did not know how to read or did not permit myself to read, which might be different things, and I am still not certain which it was. "He is not," she said, "much like you." The sentence was entirely plain. She did not elaborate on it. She picked up her teacup and looked out the library window at the April rain. "No," I said, "I suppose he isn't." "That is not a criticism," she said, "simply an observation." "I know," I said. She set the teacup down. She said she hoped we would continue to be friends. I said, of course. I walked her to the carriage. I went back to the library, and I sat down in the chair she had just been sitting in, which was not something I had ever done before, and which I found I had done without thinking about it, and I sat for 2 hours. "He is not much like you." What she was telling me, I think, in the only terms she could use without making explicit a declaration she had no reason to make, it. I had given her no reason, was that she knew what was different, and she was choosing the different thing because the other thing was not available. She was telling me that she was aware of what she was and was not choosing. She was doing me the courtesy of honesty, as she always did. I did not respond to that honesty with the honesty it deserved, which was, "It is available. I am here. Say the word and I am here." I went home and I sat in the library in the chair she had not been sitting in, and I held the 2 hours. And then 6 months passed, and October became November, and November became the morning of the 1st. And at 2 o'clock in the morning I lay in the dark and counted what those 6 months had been, and what the preceding 10 years had been, and what the rest was going to be if I did not act before the church opened. I have described what followed: the frost on the path, the maid's face, the white roses, the stairs. The gray eyes looking at me from the 3rd step with that specific quality, not surprised exactly, or not only surprised, but something that was also the expression of someone for whom the unexpected thing was also, somehow, the expected thing. The thing that had been absent for 10 years and had returned, badly timed, at 5 o'clock in the morning, and which she had been, perhaps, waiting for on some level she did not entirely acknowledge. She had been waiting for it. I understand this now, with the specific comprehension that comes from knowing her well and from what she said in the kitchen garden path. She had been waiting for it in the way that a person waits for something they have decided they are not waiting for actively, with their whole attention directed away from the thing they are waiting for, and yet present to it in the precise peripheral way of someone who will know the moment it arrives. She knew the moment it arrived. She came down the stairs in her dark wrapper with her hair half done, and she looked at me, and she said my name, and she let me say the thing, and when I said it, she was very still in the way she is still when she is receiving something rather than managing it. And then she told me to go home and she would send word, and I went home and she did. What she had done in the 10 minutes, which were, as I said, considerably more than 10 minutes, I have not asked about in specific detail, because it seems to me that those minutes were hers, that what she worked through in them was her own accounting, and that the conclusions she reached belonged to her in the sense that conclusions reached in private belong to the person who reached them. What I know is the outcome. She came to the kitchen garden path in the gray coat and the walking boots, and she said she had sent word to Geoffrey and to Harriet and to the church. And she looked at me with the gray eyes and said, "I have been loving you for 10 years, more than somewhat into a box." More than somewhat, the conservative version. I have been loving you for 10 years, more than somewhat into a box. 10 years in which she managed the household at Brackenhollow and taught Italian to 3 generations of village daughters, and improved the kitchen garden north bed, and read the German chemist, and wrote the composting paper, and went to Bath, and came back from Bath, and let Geoffrey Marchmont court her, because the other thing was apparently not being offered, and she was not going to wait indefinitely. 10 years in which I arranged the mortgage and the market prices and the better grammar, and came to call twice a week, and talked about everything except the thing, and composed the speech and destroyed the speech and composed it again and turned back at the gate. 10 years in which we had been in the same county at the same gatherings, across from each other at the same dinner tables, both of us managing the same thing in different ways, and neither of us quite arriving at the same word at the same time. Until this morning at 5 o'clock, in the hall with the white roses. It is better than I deserve. I know that. I have thought it several times today, and I will think it again tomorrow, and I will go on thinking it with a clarity that I hope will produce something useful in the form of actual behavior, of daily evidence, of the consistent, unambiguous declaration of a man who has learned later than he should have, at the cost of more than he had the right to spend what the thing he loves is worth. 3 weeks, and then November again. And then the rest. The door is still open. She has come in and sat down, and she has the list, and the practical matters are being managed, as they are always managed when Cecily is in a room, with clarity and competence and the particular economy of a person who does not waste movement. In a moment she will look up from the list and say my name, and I will answer, and the evening will continue in the warm, ordinary way that evenings continue when they are not the first or the last of anything, but simply the middle ones, the ones that are not story but life. I love her, I have said so, and I will go on saying so. I have told her I intend to say it every day of whatever we have, and I intend it, and I will keep the intention, because the consequence of not keeping it is something I have had 10 years to study, and I am not going to repeat. She looks up. "Hartwell," she says. "Yes," I say. "The announcement wording," she says. "Do you want to read it before it goes to Marchfield? It's fairly standard, but you may have preferences about the form." "I have no preferences about the form," I say. "I defer entirely to your judgment on the form." She looks at me with the look that is slightly different from the other looks, the one that is somewhere between amusement and something else. "That is the first time," she says, "in 5 years of acquaintance that you have told me you defer entirely to my judgment on anything." "Then it's been too long in coming," I say. She looks at the list. The small smile, the one that is only barely visible at the corner of her mouth before she has allowed herself to show it more fully, is there. Then she says, "I will send it to Marchfield tomorrow morning." "Good," I say. She makes a note. The fire is very good. The evening is dark outside the window. The list is nearly at its end. In a moment she will put it down, and we will go in to Edmund and Harriet and whatever remains of the evening's practical requirements. And then the evening will be over, and tomorrow will begin, and there will be 3 weeks of tomorrows, and then November the 22nd, which is the date she has identified. Then November the 23rd, and on, the ordinary days. I have been waiting for the ordinary days for 10 years without knowing that is what I was waiting for. I understand now. The extraordinary morning is the door to the ordinary days. The ordinary days are the point. She sets down the list. She looks at me. "Are you well?" she says. "Very well," I say. "Extremely well. Better than I have been in 10 years. She looks at me for a moment with the gray eyes, and then she says, and it is the laugh, the real one, the quick and unguarded one, the one that has not changed since October of 1815 in a muddy lane in the drizzle, "Yes, I suppose that makes 2 of us." And she picks up the list and rises and says she is going back to Harriet, and would I come in 20 minutes. I will, in 20 minutes. I am going to finish this record and put it in the desk drawer, and in 20 minutes I will go in to Harriet and Edmund and Cecily, and we will complete the evening's necessary arrangements, and then the evening will end, and we will each go home, and tomorrow will begin. In 20 minutes. Until then, the fire, and the evening, and the gray eyes, and the 10 years that have finally ended the way that long waits end when they end well. Not with fanfare, not with ceremony, not with anything that looks from the outside like what it was on the inside, but with a woman in a gray coat at a kitchen garden gate saying, "I have been loving you for 10 years more than somewhat into a box," and a man saying, "I love you," as though he has been saving the words since October of 1815, which he has, and both of them knowing that the next 20 years are going to be different. In 20 minutes, what I learned in those 2.5 hours, and in the weeks that followed, was a very great deal about Cecily Vane, accumulated through the particular method of paying close attention to someone who says exactly what she thinks and does not withhold information about herself out of social caution. She had been managing the household at Brackenhollow for 2 years, since her mother's death in the autumn of 1813. Her elder sister's Eleanor, who had married a solicitor in Bath and settled there with apparent contentment, and Harriet, who had married a gentleman of Lincolnshire and was establishing herself in that county with the determined efficiency that was Harriet's primary quality, had both married before the full weight of the Brackenhollow situation became clear, and afterward could not easily be called back, and Cecily had not attempted to call them back. She had looked at what needed doing and had done it. This was not presented to me as a sacrifice or a burden. It was simply a description of the situation. The household required management, and she was the person available to manage it. She had taken over the accounts. She had renegotiated the household's arrangements with suppliers coal, candles, bread, meat, with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understands that small savings accumulated are not small. She had reorganized the kitchen garden, which had been managed for ornamental purposes under her mother's tenure, into a productive operation that generated meaningful income through the sale of surplus at the village market. She had taken over the management of the estate's correspondence with Marchfield, the solicitor, because Edmund's approach to financial correspondence was too optimistic to be reliable. She had done all of this between the ages of 21 and 23, and she continued doing it with the same methodical, unsentimental competence. When I asked, in our second or third conversation, whether she found it a great deal, she considered the question with the fairness she brought to all questions and said, "I find it useful. Whether I find it a great deal depends on what I'm comparing it to, and I try not to make comparisons that don't lead anywhere." It was such a Cecily answer that I found myself thinking about it for several days afterward. She read extensively and eclectically agricultural reports and Italian poetry and old economics and the newspapers, and she read them all the same way, closely, with a pencil in hand for the passages that required marking, with the specific, absorbed quality of someone for whom reading is how they stay genuinely engaged with the world, rather than simply operating within it. She was teaching herself Italian. She had found a grammar and a dictionary in the estate library, old ones, belonging to some earlier vein with continental ambitions, and was working through them methodically in the evenings, an hour a night after the household work was done. She was partway through a collection of Dante's letters, reading them slowly and looking up every word she wasn't sure of, and she had views about them that were entirely her own, formed without the benefit of anyone to argue with. When I mentioned, in our third conversation, that I had spent a year in Florence before the war, she looked at me with an expression that was not envious and not wistful, but was interested in the very specific and personal way that someone is interested when you tell them you have been somewhere they have been working toward for months. "Is the grammar I have been using adequate?" she asked. "It depends what you mean by adequate," I said. "It is grammatically sound, it will give you the structure. But it is old, and the vocabulary is somewhat formal, and if you want to read Dante comfortably, you may find the lexical gaps frustrating." "I have been finding the lexical gaps frustrating," she said, with such plain relief at having the diagnosis confirmed that I laughed. "I have a more recent grammar at Hartwell," I said. "Acquired in Florence and somewhat annotated. You are welcome to it." She accepted the offer with the directness she brought to all practical assistance, genuinely, without performance. Over the weeks that followed, we conducted what was effectively a small tutorial in Italian grammar, conducted partly in person and partly in notes. She would ask a specific question about a construction in Dante. I would answer it. She would ask a follow-up. The notes had the quality, I noticed, of actual correspondence rather than social exchange. Brief, precise, asking what they wanted to know rather than managing any impression. Her handwriting was very clear, the hand of someone who has written a great many practical letters and has decided that clarity serves better than elegance. She was funny. This took several visits to establish clearly, because her humor was dry enough that it could be missed if you were not paying the right kind of attention. But it was there a quality of observation about the small absurdities of daily life, stated without emphasis, but with a precision that made the absurdity visible, the kind of humor only available to people who are looking at things very directly and have no investment in the flattering version. She was interested in practical things. Not exclusively, she was interested in Dante and Cowper, and whether the Corn Laws would survive their own contradictions, and she had views on all three that were worth arguing with. But she was particularly interested in the way things worked, how the drainage of a field related to the crop it could support, how the timing of a wall repair related to the kind of failure developing in it, how the management of a household account related to the well-being of the people in the household. She was interested in causes and effects, in the relationship between decisions and outcomes, in the way the material world responded to the people who inhabited it. She was, I understood after perhaps a month of these conversations, the most genuinely intelligent person I had spent regular time with since Oxford, and she had arrived at this intelligence without any of the institutional scaffolding that Oxford provides, without tutors or curricula, or the company of other people equally engaged in the project of understanding things. She had arrived at it through the habit of looking carefully at whatever was in front of her and thinking about what she saw. By December, I was in love with her, and I knew it. I had been in love before, or in something adjacent to love. The warm, engaging, temporarily absorbing feeling of attraction and interest, and the pleasure of another person's company that passes for love when it is not tested. What I felt for Cecily Vane was different in kind, not only in intensity. It had the quality of inevitability that love, when it is real, tends to have, not the melodramatic inevitability of romantic narratives, but the quieter kind, the kind that says, "This is the true thing. The other versions were preparations for this." I recognized it with a kind of resigned clarity, the way one recognizes something one has been expecting. I was 31, she was 23. I was a duke with a large estate and a position in society that came with its own demands. She was a gentleman's daughter of no fortune and an encumbered estate. The county would not oppose the match. I was in a position to marry anyone I chose, but it would remark on it, in the way that it remarks on things not expected, and the remarking would be at Cecily's expense rather than mine, because that is how it works. I was not sure I had the right to put that upon her without knowing whether she wanted what it came with. More than any of that, I was not certain she felt what I felt. I thought she might. I thought the quality of her attention toward me, the way she actually listened, the ease that developed in our conversations, the particular way she laughed at things I said, the occasional moment in which I caught her looking at me with an expression I could not entirely account for. I thought these were evidence of something. But I was also 31 years old and in love, and therefore not a reliable analyst of the evidence. I told myself I would speak in the new year, that the ground was there. That patience and a clear occasion were all that was needed. It was Pemberton who first told me about the debt. He came to my study in the third week of December with the quarterly accounts, and at the end of our discussion, he set them aside and paused in the particular way he pauses when he has something to say that he considers his professional duty, but knows will not be welcomed. "The Vane situation," he said. "I have spoken with Marchfield." Marchfield was the village solicitor who held more of the county's practical confidences than anyone, by virtue of being discreet, competent, and constitutionally unable to be surprised by human financial behavior. And I said, "The mortgage is in serious difficulty. Not the interest. The interest has been met barely every year. The principal note is due in April. The estate does not have the means to meet it." Marchfield indicated he was not explicit, but I understood him clearly that unless something changes materially in the next 3 months, the estate will need to be sold. I sat with this. The fire was burning well. The December afternoon was dark and cold outside the window. "How much is the principal note?" I said. Pemberton told me. It was not a large sum by the standard of great estates. It was an insuperable sum by the standard of the Vane estate's income. "Thank you," I said. "That will be all." He withdrew. I sat in the study for a long time. The fire burned down. I called for it to be rebuilt and sat with the rebuilt fire for a further period. Then I made a decision. In London, I called on a property factor named Fosbury, who had executed 2 previous transactions for me that required a certain structural indirection. I told him what I wanted to do: purchase the Brackenhollow mortgage from the Bristol firm that held it, restructure the terms to a repayment schedule derived from the estate's actual income, spread over 20 years at the minimum viable interest rate, and do this through a London firm that Edmund Vane would not recognize, in such a way that nothing about the transaction could be traced to its origin. I want to be honest about my own motives because this account is the honest one. The act was not purely selfless. I was in love with the woman who was managing that household, and I could not watch the household fail. The anonymity was genuinely meant. I did not want Cecily to be put in the position of owing a specific and identifiable debt to the man who lived a mile and a half down the lane, because that debt would have changed the texture of everything between us, made every conversation a negotiation with an unacknowledged obligation underneath it. I wanted her free with me as she had always been, without owing anything, without managing anything except the conversation itself. So the anonymity served her, but the impulse was love. Fosbury executed the arrangement in the 2nd week of January, and Edmund Vane received a letter from a firm called Hartwick & Settle, of Holborn, informing him that his mortgage had been acquired and that new and considerably improved terms were being offered, effective immediately. He read the letter 3 times, called Marchfield in a state of considerable agitation, spent 2 days in alternating anxiety and hope, while Marchfield investigated the legitimacy of the firm, and had finally settled into a relief so thorough and complete that it apparently occupied him entirely for a week before the next scheme began to present itself. I returned from London in late January and told myself again that I would speak in the spring. Aldrich arrived at Hartwell in February. My cousin Aldrich Hartwell-Foss was 2 years my junior, dark-haired and well-built, with the easy, unconstructed confidence of someone who has never had occasion to doubt his welcome in a room. He had been on the continent for 2 years. Following a financial unpleasantness, I will not detail beyond saying it had involved other people's money and decisions whose wisdom had been disputed by those people. He had spent the 2 years in Paris and Rome and various Mediterranean cities, with what his letters described as considerable enjoyment, and he had apparently concluded from this that the unpleasantness was sufficiently behind him to return. He wrote to me from Paris in January asking if Hartwell could receive him. I wrote back to say of course. He arrived in the 2nd week of February with 3 trunks, and the particular kind of bright, sociable energy that characterizes men who have spent 2 years being entertaining in cities where entertainment was the main project. Aldrich was clever in the social mode, very good at reading situations and people, quick to find the interesting angle, genuinely amusing in a way that required intelligence rather than only performance. He was also constitutionally committed to his own amusement, which meant that his attention was sharp and genuine while it lasted. He renewed his county acquaintances within a fortnight. He was invited to the Aldenmere dinners. He appeared at the Penwick supper. He was, everywhere he went, exactly what he always was: the person who made the room more entertaining, who found the interesting angle on any subject, who made people feel seen in a way that was pleasant while it was happening and somehow less substantial in retrospect than it had felt in the moment. He met Cecily at a dinner at the Aldenmere estate in the last days of February. I was present. I was watching, for reasons I was not at that point examining clearly. What I saw was this: Aldrich registered her within the first minute of their introduction, not with the quick social assessment of rank and appearance that most men apply to most women at most dinners, but with the sharper attention of a man who has found something unexpected. He sat next to her. Lady Aldenmere had arranged the table with her usual strategic intention, and he said something, and she responded, and he laughed, and then she said something in return, and he went still for a moment in the way people do when they are genuinely surprised. They talked for 40 minutes. The conversation at their end of the table had the sharper, more animated quality of 2 people who are actually arguing about something and finding it interesting. I could not hear the specifics, but the quality was unmistakable. I recognized it, because I had been sitting in that same quality of conversation with Cecily for 4 months. In the carriage going home, Aldrich said, "The vain girl." "Yes," I said. "3rd daughter." Who is she? I told him, modest estate, no fortune, sharp mind. Sharp, he said, in the appreciating tone of a man who has found something he did not expect. She told me I was speaking nonsense about the Baltic trade. She was right. She had read the Lloyd's reports, and I had not. He sounded genuinely delighted. She is a neighbor of yours. She is, I said. He said nothing else, and I looked at the dark fields through the carriage window and told myself that Aldrich found many things interesting, and that interesting things held his attention for variable periods. He began calling at Brackenhollow the following week. Once, then twice, then 3 times. He went walking with her in the county lanes on occasions I heard about through the county's reliable social information system. He was at every gathering where she was present. He sent her the newer Italian grammar I had mentioned was available in London, a more thoughtful gesture than most of what Aldrich did, because it meant he had remembered a detail I had mentioned and acted on it, which was not his usual mode. She accepted the grammar. I knew this because she sent a note to Hartwell addressed to me, thanking me for the earlier loan of my own grammar, which she was returning, and mentioning with a quality in the phrasing I could not entirely decode that Mr. Hartwell Foss had been very kind to procure the newer edition. I read this note 3 times. Then I folded it and put it in the desk drawer and went to look at the eastern field. I should have spoken in March. I have known this for 10 years, and I know it now with the clarity that only distance provides. In March, Aldrich had been back a month. His visits to Brackenhollow were established but not frequent, and whatever was developing between them was at a stage that could still have been interrupted without harm to anyone. There was a period of perhaps 3 weeks, a window, a specific and limited aperture in which I could have gone to Brackenhollow on a Tuesday afternoon when Edmund was occupied elsewhere, and I could have said what I had been meaning to say since November, and the situation would have been clear. I did not go. The reason I gave myself was that the occasion was not right, that Aldrich's presence made it complicated, that I did not want to appear to be reacting to Aldrich rather than acting from my own feeling, which was genuine and had predated Aldrich's arrival by 4 months. All of this was true in small ways and insufficient in the large way, because the large way was this: I was frightened. Specifically, I was frightened of comparison. Before Aldrich, I had been the only person in the situation. Cecily and I talked, and I had no basis for wondering whether what I felt was felt in return, because there was nothing to measure it against. After Aldrich, I had something to measure it against. The quality of her engagement with him, the brightness of it, the quick argumentative ease, the real laugh coming freely and often, was something I recognized because I had experienced it myself, and it introduced a question that I had not previously had occasion to ask. Was what I had been reading as something specific actually something general? Was the directness and the argument and the laughter simply the response Cecily had to anyone who engaged her genuinely? Or was there something more particular in how she was with me? I did not know, and not knowing, I could not convince myself to speak. Because if what I had been reading as particular was in fact general, then the speech I had been planning would land not as the declaration of a feeling she knew something of, but as a surprise, and Cecily's honest response to an unwelcome surprise was something I did not think I could navigate. So I waited, and March became April, and April became May. In May, Aldrich came to my library on a Tuesday evening and closed the door. He stood by the fireplace with the expression of a man who is serious about something for once, without the usual bright performance between him and the world. "I am in love with Cecily Vane," he said. "I know it is soon, I know it has happened quickly, but I have never met a woman like her in my life, and I intend to speak to her father." He paused. "Then, if there is something I should know, Hartwell, if you have any claim or intention that I am not aware of, I am asking you directly." He was giving me the opening. He was standing in my library and giving me 5 seconds to say what I had spent 7 months not saying. I sat very still. I looked at the fire. "There is nothing you should know," I said. "She is a neighbor and a friend, and I wish you well." He offered, she accepted. The announcement was made at the end of July, and Lady Aldenmere gave a party. I attended. I drank her health and shook Aldrich's hand and talked to enough people about enough other things to manage the evening. And I went home, and I sat in the library in the dark for a considerable time, and I allowed myself to understand, with the precision of a man who has finally removed all the qualifications and left the thing plain, that I had loved Cecily Vane since October and had failed to say so, and that the failure was entirely and specifically mine. At the party, Cecily had caught my eye from across the room. Once, for 2 seconds. Her expression was composed, and underneath the composure was something I could not read, or would not read, or could not afford to read, and I had looked away. That was 10 years ago. The engagement ended in January. The signs of difficulty had been visible, in retrospect, from November, but I had not been looking for them. I was in London for parliamentary business, and returned to Gloucestershire in December to find the county's drawing-room network carrying the careful, qualified murmur that indicates a situation in flux. Pemberton told me, when I asked, that Aldrich had been seen twice in Cirencester in circumstances that were difficult to characterize precisely and easy to characterize generally. He told me also that Miss Vane had been seen at Marchfield's office. I assembled these facts and understood what they meant. I sent a note to Brackenhollow the following week, not about the engagement, about the hedge on the shared boundary, which was a genuine matter requiring attention, and which gave me a reason to address her directly. I added at the end, I hope you will allow me to call. Whatever else I am or am not, I am your friend and I wish you to know it. She wrote back 2 days later in the clear hand I had learned to recognize, Thank you. I am well and not in need of concern. I will write about the hedge when the spring comes. It was precisely the response of a woman who has assessed the situation, determined what the next period of her life needs to look like, and is managing toward it with the competence she brings to everything. She did not want me to call. I respected this, because she was entitled to it, and because I was not certain that my calling would serve her rather than me. The engagement ended formally in late January. Aldrich went to London and then to Edinburgh. There was no public scandal, which I attributed to Marchfield's careful management, and to Cecily's own handling of the situation. I would have bet a significant sum that her letters in the matter were precise and unemotional, and left no room for ambiguity. She was 24 years old, and she had been engaged and disengaged in 6 months, and she was in Brackenhollow with her father and the kitchen garden and the Italian grammar, and she had told me she was well and did not need concern. I did not call at Brackenhollow for 4 months after the engagement ended. The honest reason is the one I have already given. I did not know what to say. There was a version of a call that would have been honest and clear. I could have gone to her and said, I have been in love with you since October. I failed to tell you, and I am telling you now. But the man who steps forward the moment a rival has stepped back does not occupy a position that reflects well on him, whatever the truth of his feelings, and the appearance would have been the same as the thing even if the thing was different from the appearance. I managed from a distance instead. The mortgage continued on its favorable terms. I found that the kitchen garden's surplus was being sold at the village market, and I arranged through a chain of careful intermediaries that the prices paid at that market were somewhat better than the market would otherwise have offered, specifically for the produce that came from the Brackenhollow side of the lane. When I learned that Cecily had taken on Italian instruction for the vicar's 3 daughters for a modest quarterly consideration, not enough, but something I found additional channels. These were not substitutes for the declaration I was not making. I knew that. They were what I could offer without crossing the line into presumption, a silent, structural care that required nothing of her and announced nothing about me. I am aware that there is something both touching and slightly absurd about a duke in love arranging better vegetable prices through a chain of discreet agents, rather than simply going to the woman's house and speaking. I was aware of it at the time. I began calling at Brackenhollow again in May, when she wrote about the hedge, and the letter had a quality slightly less managed, more like herself, that told me the worst of the immediate period was past. We looked at the hedge together in the lane on a warm May morning, and we talked about it, and then we talked about other things, and I walked back to Hartwell thinking, there it is. The thing is still there. The thing, I could not name it precisely, but I could feel it. The quality of her attention toward me, the particular way she listened, the ease that developed when she was thinking rather than managing. The way she looked at the hedge, actually looked at it, the way she looked at everything as though it were worth looking at carefully. The laugh when it came, which was the same laugh it had always been, the real one, the one that wasn't for anyone. I told myself the spring had been long enough. I began planning. The plan never executed. This became the pattern of the subsequent years. Planning, delaying, finding a reason the occasion was not right, and then beginning to plan again. Each cycle consumed several months. I planned in May of 1817 and delayed through June, planned again in July and delayed through August. By September, I had stopped calling it planning and begun calling it considering, which is what planning becomes when you have been doing it for a year and have not yet acted. She was 25 that autumn, 26 the following year. I watched her across the county's social calendar with the attention I had been paying since October of 1815, and I learned things about her as she continued to develop the Italian lessons she started for the vicar's daughters were going well. She told me at a dinner in the autumn of 1817, two of them reading Dante without a dictionary by the following spring, which was one of the more satisfying things she had accomplished, she said, in a way that meant it. The preserved plum enterprise was expanding. She had found a pamphlet on greenhouse management and was implementing its recommendations in the kitchen garden with characteristic methodical care. A small Linta structure of glass and old timber that extended the growing season by 6 weeks and produced cucumbers in June that Brackenhollow had not had access to before. I watched her be entirely, consistently herself across a range of circumstances, and I found with each passing year that the love was not diminishing. I had been quietly hoping it might, because a diminishing love would have been something I could manage. It was not diminishing. She was 27. She was at the Aldenmere Christmas party, and we stood near the fireplace for 20 minutes discussing a pamphlet on crop rotation she had found. And she had views on it, and I had views. And at some point in the middle of the conversation, I noticed I was watching her talk more than I was participating in what she was saying. And I made myself come back, and she gave me a look that might have been awareness of what I was doing, or might simply have been the directness she always brought to observation. 28. The winter of the 28th year was the winter I came closest. I composed the speech in detail, over 3 weeks in January. I had the occasion in mind, a quiet afternoon call at Brackenhollow, the two of us in the drawing room, Edmund occupied elsewhere, a fire and tea and the right silence. I rehearsed the opening. I rehearsed the possible responses. I held both versions in my mind, the yes and the no, and practiced staying steady in the face of each. And then she went to Bath. She was invited by her cousin, Mrs. Fairfax, a widow of comfortable means who had a good house in the upper part of the town, and had been pressing the invitation for 2 years on the grounds that Cecily was too buried in the country and could benefit from a change of air and company. Cecily had declined twice before. This year she accepted. I drafted 2 letters to her while she was away. Both times I did not send them. The second draft was in April, 2 weeks before she was due to return, and I did not send it because a letter arriving 2 weeks before her return rather than 2 weeks after her departure was not the evidence of spontaneous feeling I wanted it to be. This was, I am aware, a very small distinction to hang so much upon. She came back in July, and at the first Aldenmere gathering of the autumn she was exactly herself. The gray eyes and the direct manner and the opinions, and an addition of enthusiasm about a glass-making workshop in Bath that she had visited, which she described in the specific, textured detail of someone who had found it genuinely interesting. She was unchanged in every way that mattered, which was to say, nothing in Bath had changed the thing between us, and no eligible gentleman of Bath had constituted a serious alternative, and I saw no evidence in her manner that any of these statements was otherwise. I did not speak before Christmas. I had by this point stopped making the speech in my head, because I had made it too many times, and it was starting to feel practiced in a way that was itself a reason to delay, on the grounds that the practiced quality was inauthentic, and I needed to find a fresher way to begin. She was 29, 30. At 30, I ran out of the particular category of excuse that had been sustaining me. The excuse was, essentially, a kind of ambient waiting for the right moment, for the right occasion, for the readiness in myself that I kept locating just on the other side of whatever was currently happening. I had been doing this for 9 years, and at 30 I stopped being able to pretend I didn't know I was doing it. I knew exactly what I was doing, and what I had been doing, and what I would continue to do indefinitely if I didn't stop. I resolved, with what felt like genuine finality, to speak before Christmas of that year. Not as a plan, which could be revised, as a fixed intention, which could not. Geoffrey Marchmont arrived in the county in September. He came to visit his uncle, who owned the Penwick estate on the eastern side of the county. Geoffrey was 40, a widower of 3 years, with a considered, steady manner and the quality of presence that belongs to people who have lived through something that required them to slow down and come back. He had a daughter of 7, who lived with his sister in Wiltshire, while he managed the practical realities of his situation. He was, from every angle at which I observed him, exactly what he appeared to be. A decent, kind, thoughtful man who had been lonely for 3 years and was beginning, carefully, to look at the world again. He met Cecily at the Penwick Estates autumn gathering in the 3rd week of September. I was there. I watched the introduction. What I watched was this. He was introduced to her, and he shook her hand, and he asked her something, and she answered, and he listened in the way that people who are genuinely attentive listen, not formulating his response while she was speaking, but actually hearing what she said. And she responded to that listening in the way she always responded to someone who was actually listening, with more of herself, the less managed version. I watched this from the far side of the room, and I felt, with the specific precision that comes from 10 years of close observation of one person, what it meant. He courted her with the same steadiness that characterized everything he did. He called at Brackenhollow. He walked with her in the county lanes. He appeared at the dinners and gatherings with a consistency that was not intrusive but was present, the way a serious intention is present, quietly, reliably, without drama. She let him call. She accepted his walks. She had him to dinner twice in October and once in November. In November, I made a plan. A specific, real plan with a specific date. A call at Brackenhollow on the 17th, a Thursday afternoon, when Edmund was known to be attending an agricultural meeting at the Aldenmere estate. I wrote the date in my diary. I rehearsed the opening. On the 17th of November, I rode in the direction of Brackenhollow and turned back before the gate. I cannot explain this fully. The closest I have come is, Geoffrey Marchmont's presence had made the stakes concrete in a way they had not been before, and the concrete stakes produced a fear more specific and therefore more disabling than the ambient fear of the preceding years. If I went to Brackenhollow and she refused me and then accepted Geoffrey, I would have the refusal to carry alongside the loss. If I went and she had already decided in Geoffrey's favor, the refusal would be compounded by the timing. The only version I could not hold in my mind was the one in which she did not refuse, because wanting it too clearly was its own kind of dangerous. I turned back at the gate. I told myself I would find a better occasion. I was still telling myself this in the 3rd week of April, when Pemberton reported that Lord Marchmont had spoken to Edmund Vane and received his blessing, and that an announcement was expected within the fortnight. 3 days later, Cecily came to Hartwell. She arrived on a Thursday morning in the April gray, wearing the dark coat she wore when she had practical business, and she had the look, when I went into the hall to receive her, of someone doing a difficult thing in the direct, committed way she did all difficult things. I took her into the library. I had tea brought, and we sat with it in the way we had sat in her drawing room many times over 10 years. 2 people who knew each other well enough to let the silence breathe for a moment before one of them began. "I wanted to tell you," she said, "before you heard it from Lady Aldenmere over the syllabub." "About Lord Marchmont," I said. "Yes, has Pemberton told you?" "He mentioned that a conversation with your father had occurred," I said. She nodded and looked at the tea. Outside the library window, the April rain continued. "I wanted you to know because you have been a great friend to me for a long time. I would not want you to hear it in the wrong way from the wrong person. I value what we have been to each other." "And I said. "Are you happy for me?" she said, looking up. I am not asking you to perform it. I am asking, actually." This was such a Cecily question, so exactly the kind of thing she would ask. The kind that cuts through social performance and demands the real answer, that something caught in my throat for a moment. "I hope you will be happy," I said. "That is entirely genuine, and he is a good man." "He is," she said. "He is steady and kind, and he takes me seriously. That is not nothing." "No," I said, "it is a great deal." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I am 31, she said, just that, as a fact." She was 31 years old, and she was choosing sufficiency over waiting. I could see it in the way she spoke, not unhappily, not with regret that she was performing, but with the careful, honest tone of a woman who has assessed her options and made a reasonable choice, and is at peace with the reasonableness of it. I could see it because I knew her, and because she did not hide things from people she trusted, and because she had the directness to let what she was choosing be visible in the choosing of it, without dressing it in more than it was. She set down her teacup. She said she hoped we would continue as friends. I said, of course. I walked her to her carriage. I went back to the library. I sat for 2 hours without moving. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I have attended 2 engagement dinners. I have shaken Geoffrey Marchmont's hand with genuine civility, because the man deserves civility and more, and has done nothing wrong except fall in love with the right woman at a time when the wrong man had already lost her through his own failures. The wedding was arranged for the 1st of November today at the church at Hartwell Village. The church was the nearest to Brackenhollow, and Cecily had chosen the practical option, which was entirely characteristic of her. I went to bed last night intending to attend, to behave with dignity and to say nothing. I woke at 2 o'clock in the morning. I lay in the dark and counted 10 years. The lane, the December of the mortgage, Aldrich in my library in May, the 5 seconds I had not taken, the springs I had not spoken, Bath. The gate in November. I counted all of it, and then I counted what it added to, which was a decade of love managed badly, and a morning about to arrive in which the door would close permanently, and I would be the person who had let it close. I was dressed before 4 o'clock. I want to be clear about what this was, not courage in the formal sense. The end of fear, which is sometimes what courage looks like from the outside, and from the inside looks like simply running out of the capacity to be afraid of the particular thing you have been afraid of for 10 years. I was going to lose her today if I did not go to Brackenhollow. I had already been losing her for 10 years. The only difference between 10 years of not speaking and this morning's not speaking was that today it would be final. I went to Brackenhollow. The house was lit when I arrived, lamps in the upper windows, the sounds of a household in early preparation. It was not yet 5 o'clock. The frost was on the path, and the first suggestion of light was beginning at the eastern edge of the sky, very faint, very cold. I knocked at the front door. The maid who opened it was young and clearly had not imagined, when she got up that morning, that a duke would be at the door before 5 o'clock. She looked at me with the expression of a person confronting something the training did not cover. I asked for Miss Vane. I said I understood she was preparing. I said I was asking for 5 minutes and that she could decline and that I would entirely understand if she did. The maid went. I waited in the hall. White roses were everywhere in the jugs on the hall table, in sprays along the staircase rail, in a large bowl on the stand by the window. The smell of them was heavy in the cold air of the early morning, sweet and very slightly sharp. The window at the end of the hall was showing a strip of dark sky that was beginning, very gradually, to become less dark. She came down the stairs. She was in a dark wrapper, her hair half-finished pinned at the crown but loose at the sides, dark strands falling across her shoulder. She was midway through becoming the woman who was going to be married this morning, and the intermediate state, neither quite assembled nor quite herself, as she was privately, was visible in the quality of her presence, which was less managed than I had ever seen it. She looked at me from the 3rd step. Her expression was, as it usually was, composed on the surface and more complex beneath. Beneath the complexity was something I could not quite name, something that had, perhaps, been prepared for, or at least not entirely surprised by. "Hartwell," she said. "I know what I am doing," I said. "I know it is wrong in every timing. I know the word for a man who comes to a woman's door on the morning of her wedding to say what he did not say when it would have been appropriate, or kind, or any of the things it would have been had he said it in any of the previous 10 years. I know all of that. I am going to say it anyway." She did not speak. She stood on the stairs and looked at me with the gray eyes, which were very clear. "I have been in love with you since October of 1815, I said. "Since the lane and the branch that was the wrong size and a conversation about drainage that lasted 50 minutes in the drizzle. I did not say so in October. I did not say so in November or December or January or any of the months that followed. I did not say so when Aldrich came or when Aldrich's engagement ended or in any of the 9 years since. I cannot give those years back. They are gone. I can only tell you that the thing I did not say has been in my chest every day of those 10 years, and that I am done not saying it. I love you. I have loved you every day of the decade. I have thought about you every day and wanted to tell you things every day and looked across every room you were in with the specific attention of a man who is entirely occupied with where one person is and what they are thinking. and the mortgage at Brackenhollow, which has been on very favorable terms for the past 10 years, is I stopped. I had not intended to say that. That is not the point. I am sorry. The point is only the other thing. She was very still. The mortgage, she said, the factor in London. Yes, I said. I found out 2 years ago, she said. I asked Marchfield directly. He wouldn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it, and I know Marchfield well enough to read the difference. I've known for 2 years. I looked at her. I told myself it was a neighbor's act, she said. The kind of thing a man in your position would do for any family in difficulty in the county, that it had no particular significance. She looked at me with the clear gray eyes. I knew it had particular significance. It did, I said. Yes, she said, I know. The sounds of the household were audible above us, a door, a voice, quick footsteps. The window at the end of the hall was perceptibly lighter now, the sky outside shifting from black to the cold gray of a November dawn. Geoffrey is a good man, she said. He is, I said. This is not about Geoffrey. No, she said, it isn't. She came down the last 3 stairs. She was close to me, now close enough that I could see the shadow under her eyes that suggested she had not slept well. Close enough that the familiar quality of her presence was very specific and very recognizable. Tell me one thing, she said. Anything, I said. Without Geoffrey, she said. Without this morning, if it had simply been the next year or the year after with things as they have been, would you have said this? At some point that was not this morning. The honest question, the one that could not be avoided. I looked at her. I don't know, I said. I had resolved to speak in the autumn genuinely with a specific date in mind. I had the occasion planned. And then I turned back at your gate, and I do not fully understand why, and I cannot tell you with certainty what the next year would have brought. I believe I would have spoken. I am not certain. And you deserve the answer that requires you to forgive the least, and I will not purchase your sympathy with a certainty I don't have. She was quiet for a moment. The dawn was advancing in the window behind her. Her hair was falling loose across her shoulder, just as it had in the lane in October, 10 years ago, and she was standing in her dark wrapper with the white roses all around her and the cold light beginning. Then she made a sound that was not entirely laugh, and not entirely anything else, something produced at the exact intersection of recognition and pain, and the slightly rueful acknowledgement of a situation that has been, in retrospect, somewhat avoidable. 10 years, she said. Yes, I said. I had hope, she said. After Aldrich, after January, I thought perhaps you would come. I thought the thing I had been feeling from you across all those months was real. And when you didn't come, I told myself I had been projecting, that I had wanted to see something that wasn't there. You were not projecting, I said. What you felt from me was real. I know, she said. I have always known, I think. But a thing that is never confirmed begins, after enough years, to feel like something you invented. I am sorry, I said, for all of it, for 10 years of leaving it unconfirmed. She looked at me for another moment. Then, go home, I need 10 minutes, I need to think, go home and I will send word. I went home. I sat in the library for 3 hours and 20 minutes. The November morning made itself outside the window. The frost on the fields caught the early light and held it for a while before giving it back. The mist in the lower places burned off slowly. Pemberton came at 8 with the post and said nothing that required a response and brought coffee and went. The clock showed 7 and 8 and 9. At 9:20, there was a knock at the side door. She was standing in the kitchen garden path in her gray coat and her walking boots. Her hair was properly pinned now. She had taken rather more than 10 minutes, but she had taken them well. She was composed in the way she is composed when she has made a decision and is now executing it, entirely herself, clear-eyed and settled, and moving forward with the particular deliberate certainty that is her natural mode. She was not in the wedding dress. I have sent word to Geoffrey, she said, and to Harriet, who arrived this morning. The church has been notified. She met my eyes. I am sorry for Geoffrey. He did nothing wrong, and he will have a bad morning, and he deserved better management from me. I should have been more honest with myself earlier about what I was choosing, and what I was not choosing, and why I was not choosing it. Cecily, I said. No, she said. I want to say this properly. She looked at me with that direct, clear gaze. I told myself when I accepted Geoffrey that I was being sensible, that a woman of 31 takes what is good and kind and solid rather than waiting indefinitely for something she has no evidence is going to be offered. And Jeffrey is all of those things, and I was not lying to myself about that. What I was lying to myself about was the adequacy of sufficiency. I was choosing sufficient, and I was telling myself sufficient was the same as chosen, and they are not the same. No, I said, they are not. You, she said, and stopped. She was looking at me with an expression that was composed and careful, and beneath the care, something open that she was allowing to be open. I have been managing a feeling I had about you since October of 1815. Not managing it well, putting it in a box and closing the lid, and taking it out when the lid would not stay closed, and closing it again. When you didn't speak after Aldrich, I decided the feeling was mine alone, and I put it in the box more firmly, and I went to Bath, and I let Jeffrey court me, and I made a very sensible decision. And here I am in your kitchen garden path. Here you are, I said. Yes, she said, here I am. She looked at me. I would like to stop closing the lid. I reached for her hands. They were very cold. She had walked from Brackenhollow without gloves, which was exactly the kind of practical oversight that happened when she was attending to something that mattered more than gloves. I held them in mine, which were warm from the kitchen door. I love you, I said. I have loved you for 10 years, and I intend to tell you so every day for the rest of however long we have. And I intend to spend those days giving you evidence that the person who was capable of this particular morning's cowardice is also capable of not repeating it. She looked at me. I love you, she said. I have been loving you for 10 years more than somewhat into a box. I should like to stop. Then stop, I said. I have stopped, she said. As of approximately an hour ago, in my bedroom, when I decided. She was standing in the frost of the kitchen garden path with her cold hands in mine, and the November morning around her, and the gray eyes very clear and very steady. And she was Cecily Vane, who had been managing Brackenhollow since she was 21, and managing her feelings for me for 10 years with more practical competence than I had managed mine. Come inside, I said. Your hands are extremely cold. In a moment, she said. Say it again in the daylight. I want to see your face when you say it. I love you, I said. I have loved you since a broken axle and a wrong-sized branch and a conversation about hedgerows in the October drizzle. I have loved you every day since. I intend to love you every day of every year following this one, and I intend to be not at all subtle about it. Good, she said. I have had quite enough of subtlety for 1 decade. She squeezed my hands in the deliberate, decisive way she does things and said, My father will need an explanation. I'll give him one this afternoon, I said. Harriet will be considerable. I can manage Harriet. Lady Aldenmere will have a great deal to say for the next 20 years. She already does, I said. I have never found it a useful governing principle. She laughed, the real one, quick, unguarded, the laugh that was not performing anything, the one I had been hoarding for 10 years. It was exactly as it had been in the lane in October of 1815, which is to say it was everything. We went inside. The afternoon that followed was eventful in the way that afternoons following cancelled weddings are eventful. Edmund Vane sat in the drawing room for 45 seconds in silence after I had spoken, and then said, I thought you were calling here too often about the fence, which was perceptive enough that I revised upward my assessment of how much attention he had been paying over the years. He was warm about it in the end, because he loved his daughter and had known me for a decade, and the arithmetic, once he had completed it, appeared satisfactory. Harriet arrived at 11, flushed from the carriage and carrying every concern about the morning's disruption with the thoroughness of a general managing an unexpected reversal. The guests, the church, Jeffrey, the breakfast at Aldenmere that had already been laid out, the roses that had been very expensive, she addressed each in sequence with considerable energy. Cecily listened through the inventory with characteristic patience, and when it was complete said, I know, I am sorry for all of it. I will account for all of it. I am not marrying Jeffrey. Harriet sat down. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, You had better be very good to her. And I said that was my project, and she said, Yes, I suppose it clearly is, in a tone that suggested she had perhaps been aware of certain things for longer than she had let on. Geoffrey Marchmont I did not see. Pemberton managed the notification to the church. The guests were received at the porch by the vicar and informed that the wedding was postponed. The breakfast at Aldenmere was redirected to those guests who wished to attend anyway. Lady Aldenmere received Pemberton's message with a silence, and then a single inhalation, and then, apparently, a look of the particular type that means a woman is already composing the dinner party story she will tell about this for 20 years. I spoke to Geoffrey through Marchfield, through a formal channel, with language as considerate as I could make it. He was, I was told, quiet about it, and had the dignity not to make it worse than it was. He is a good man, and good men deserve to have their pain respected. He will find a woman who chooses him without the box. It is now evening. Cecily is in the drawing-room with Edmund and Harriet, working through the settlements and the announcement and the date, which is 3 weeks from today by her accounting. She determined 3 weeks this afternoon with the same decisive competence she brings to all practical matters. And when I suggested 2, she gave me the look she gives when she is prepared to be amused, but is not currently being amused, and I conceded. I am in this library at this desk, writing the shape of this day while the fire is good, and the evening is dark outside the windows, and her voice is audible through the door. I have loved that voice for 10 years. Let me say the true thing, the last thing, the one I keep arriving at when I try to find the center of the day. She said in the kitchen garden path, I have been loving you for 10 years, more than somewhat into a box. The box, that is the thing. Not the lane, though I am holding the lane. Not the mortgage, or the 5 seconds I didn't take, or the gate in November, or any of the machinery of the decade. The box she built and maintained for 10 years, the careful, practical management of a feeling she had decided was not going to be answered. The choice to go to Bath rather than wait. The choice to let Geoffrey court her rather than hope indefinitely. The sensible, competent management of an impossible situation, the same management she had brought to the household accounts, and the kitchen garden and the mortgage arrangement with the firm in Bristol. The same practical courage. The same refusal to waste time on circumstances she could not change. She had managed the feeling for 10 years, and then this morning when the truth came through the door at 5 o'clock, she opened the box. That is who she is. Not just the gray eyes and the opinions about hedgerows and the Italian lessons and the quick unguarded laugh. The practical courage to open the box when the truth required it, even at the cost of a cancelled wedding and Geoffrey Marchmont's quiet, dignified bad morning and Harriet's roses and the breakfast at Aldenmere. She is braver than I am. She has been braver than I am for 10 years because her courage expressed itself in action in choosing sufficiency over waiting, in going to Bath, in letting Geoffrey court her, in doing the living of her life rather than holding it in suspension for a declaration that might never come, while mine expressed itself in avoidance and structure and favorable mortgage terms and better vegetable prices, all of which were real, but none of which were the thing. This morning was the thing. The kitchen garden path was the thing. Her cold hands in mine was the thing. I cannot have the 10 years back. I would give a great deal to have them. But I am not sure, and this is perhaps the most surprising realization of this very long and very full day, I am not sure that the version of this where I spoke in October of 1815, or the spring of 1816, or any year before this one, would have been this. The this that exists now on the other side of 10 years, with the whole shape of what we managed, and what we couldn't manage, and what we put in boxes. I do not know that the easier version would have had this weight, this texture, this quality of being completely, unflinchingly known. Perhaps I am not arguing that 10 years of silence was the necessary price of this morning. It was not necessary. It was wasteful and foolish, and the product of a kind of fear I should have found a way to overcome far sooner, and I own that entirely, and I will own it every day of the 3 weeks and what comes after. But what I have on the other side of it is someone who knows me as I am and not as I presented myself, because there was never a presentation, only the real thing, the honest thing, the thing that was there in the lane in 1815 and in every drawing room and across every dinner table since. She knows the shape of my cowardice as well as she knows the shape of my caring. She is choosing both. That is the gift I do not deserve and am holding in 2 hands. The door is opening. She comes in with the list in her left hand and the composed, directed look of someone who has organized a situation and requires the next step confirmed. She comes to the chair across the desk, the chair she has sat in before, for the fence, for the land records, for the April afternoon when she told me about Geoffrey, for every practical purpose that a neighbor and a friend might have for a library. She sits in it differently now, which is to say she sits in it the same way and the world around it is different. Pemberton needs to speak to Marchfield tomorrow morning, she says. The announcement should go to the county papers by the end of the week. Harriet has accepted that 3 weeks is the timeline under protest. Father wants to know if you would prefer a small celebration at Brackenhollow or at Hartwell after the ceremony. Whichever you prefer, I say. She looks at me. Hartwell, since you will be its mistress, it makes more sense. Then Hartwell, I say. She makes a note on the list. Then she looks up at me again, and the look is the one I have been looking at for 10 years, direct, clear, the gray eyes absolutely level. You are going to say it again, she says. Every day, I say, more than once. I am going to have to accustom myself to it, she says. I am afraid so, I say. She looks at the list for a moment. Then she looks at me, and the real smile arrives, the unhurried, unhidden one, the one that has been reaching the eyes since a muddy lane in October of 1815, and she says, "It is a very great deal better than the alternative." It is exactly that. 10 years and a lane and a branch that was the wrong size and the gray eyes, and everything I did not say for a decade that has cost us both things we cannot have back in this morning, and her cold hands in mine, and the kitchen garden path and the frost, and the 3 weeks and Harriet's protest, and the list and the fire and the evening and all the ordinary days that come after. Better than I deserve, better than I had any right to expect. It is simply hers and mine, the real thing, the first thing. The thing that was there in October of 1815 in a muddy lane and refused, over all the long intervening years, to become anything other than what it was. I love her, I have told her so. I intend to tell her every day of whatever remains to us. She is looking at the list. She is about to tell me something practical about the announcement wording. The fire is very good. The evening is dark outside the windows. In 3 weeks it will be November again, and we will stand in the church at Hartwell Village, the small church, the practical choice, her choice, and say what we should have said 10 years ago, and then it will be the rest of our lives. It is better than anything,